1. New Beginnings. Christina Jones gripped the steering wheel tighter as her car wound through the dense forest road leading to Riverwood. The late afternoon sun filtered through towering pines, casting long shadows across the asphalt. 3 hours of driving through increasingly remote terrain had done nothing to quiet the doubts circling in her mind. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, glancing at the cardboard box on the passenger seat containing the sum total of her investigation into her sister's disappearance. Moving to the middle of nowhere based on a hunch. But hunches had been the foundation of her journalism career, and this particular hunch had gnawed at her for months. The last postcard from Melissa, sent over a year ago, featured Riverwood's quaint main street with its distinctive clock tower. "Found the perfect place to disappear for a while," her sister had written. Those words had become hauntingly prophetic when Melissa had done exactly that, disappeared without a trace. The official investigation had gone cold within weeks. "Adults have the right to start over," the detective had told Christina with thinly veiled impatience. No signs of foul play, no credit card activity. Sometimes people just want to vanish. But Christina knew her sister. Melissa wouldn't have abandoned her life without a word. Not to Christina, anyway. The Welcome to Riverwood sign appeared around a bend, its wooden surface weathered but well-maintained. Population 2,187. Christina slowed her car, taking in the first glimpses of her new home. The town nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, looking like something from a tourism brochure for rustic charm. Main Street was exactly as it appeared in Melissa's postcard, a clock tower rising above a collection of brick and timber buildings that looked largely unchanged since the early 20th century. Christina navigated toward the address she'd been given by her new landlord, a small apartment above what appeared to be a bookstore. As she parked and stepped out, stretching her stiff limbs, an older woman emerged from the shop below, wiping her hands on a floral apron. "You must be Christina. I'm Martha Winters." The woman's smile was genuine, crow's feet deepening around kind eyes. "I was beginning to worry you'd gotten lost. Cell reception is terrible until you're right in town." "The directions were perfect," Christina assured her, retrieving her suitcase from the trunk. "It's just a longer drive than I expected." "That's Riverwood for you. We're not exactly on the way to anywhere." Martha chuckled, moving to help with Christina's bags. "Let me show you upstairs. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean, and the view of the mountains is lovely in the morning." The apartment was indeed small but charming, with sloped ceilings and a bay window overlooking the street. Christina set down her box of investigation materials on a worn wooden table as Martha gave her a quick tour. "Bathroom's through there. Kitchenette's basic but functional. Heat can be finicky in winter, but we're still enjoying fall weather for now." Martha paused, studying Christina with motherly concern. "You're even prettier than your picture. If you don't mind me asking, what brings a young woman like you to our little town? Most folks your age are leaving for the cities, not coming here." Christina had prepared for this question. "I'm a writer," she said, the half-truth coming easily. "Working on a book. Needed somewhere quiet to focus." "A writer? How exciting. Well, you'll find plenty of peace and quiet here." Martha beamed. "Though fair warning, folks are friendly. You might find yourself with more social invitations than you bargained for." After Martha left, Christina unpacked methodically, arranging her sister's file on the table. She pinned a map of Riverwood to the wall, marking the locations mentioned in Melissa's sparse communications. The town wasn't large. She could probably walk its entirety in an afternoon. As dusk settled, Christina's stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since a hasty lunch at a gas station hours ago. She grabbed her jacket and headed downstairs, locking the apartment behind her. The bookstore was closed now, but Main Street still showed signs of life. A diner across the way had its lights on, windows steamed from the warmth inside. Christina headed toward it, breathing in the crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. The bell above the diner door announced her arrival, and several heads turned to appraise the newcomer. Christina felt the weight of their curious gazes as she slid into a booth by the window. A waitress with a nameplate reading Darlene approached, coffee pot in hand. "Evening, honey. Haven't seen you before, just passing through." "Actually, I just moved into the apartment above Winter's Books," Christina replied, accepting the menu Darlene offered. "Martha's place. Well, welcome to Riverwood." Darlene filled a mug with coffee without asking. "Special tonight is pot roast. Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans." "That sounds perfect, thank you." As Darlene moved away to place her order, Christina overheard fragments of conversation from a nearby table where 3 men in flannel shirts were huddled over their meals. "Third one this month. Sheriff's calling it animal attacks. Not like any animal I've ever seen. Drained completely. Blackwood's men were out there again last night. Something's not right." Christina's journalistic instincts perked up immediately. She casually glanced toward the men, noting their weathered faces and calloused hands. Locals, probably workers of some kind. Darlene returned with Christina's dinner, setting the steaming plate before her. "Anything else you need, honey?" "This is great, thanks." Christina hesitated, then added, "I couldn't help overhearing something about animal attacks." Darlene's expression tightened slightly. "Oh, that. We've had some trouble with wildlife lately. Sheriff thinks it might be a mountain lion that's developed a taste for livestock. Nothing for you to worry about in town." But there was something in the waitress's tone that suggested more concern than her words conveyed. Christina nodded, not pushing further for now. She'd learned long ago that the quickest way to shut down information was to appear too eager for it. As she ate her dinner, which was surprisingly good, Christina observed the diner's patrons. Most were clearly locals, greeting each other by name, discussing weather and local gossip. Through the window, she noticed a large black pickup truck pull up across the street, its polished surface standing out among the more modest vehicles parked along Main Street. A tall man emerged from the driver's side, his broad shoulders filling out a dark jacket. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about his presence. Several passers-by nodded deferentially as he strode toward a building with Blackwood Timber Company emblazoned above its entrance. "Who's that?" Christina asked when Darlene came to refill her coffee. Darlene followed her gaze. "That's Dominic Blackwood. Owns the timber company, biggest employer in the county. His family founded Riverwood back in the 1800s. She lowered her voice slightly. "Keeps to himself mostly. Him and his crew live up at the old Blackwood estate in the hills. Seems like an important man around here." "You could say that." Darlene's expression was unreadable. "Half the town works for him, and the other half depends on those who do. Blackwood timber is Riverwood for better or worse." After finishing her meal, Christina paid and stepped back onto the darkening street. The temperature had dropped considerably, and she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. The Blackwood Timber Company building stood imposing at the end of the block, lights still on inside despite the hour. Christina found herself walking toward it, drawn by curiosity. Through the large front windows, she could see the man from earlier, Dominic Blackwood, standing over a large table with what appeared to be maps spread across it. 2 other men stood with him, their postures suggesting they were receiving instructions. There was something almost primal about the way the others deferred to him, something that stirred Christina's curiosity. As if sensing her observation, Dominic suddenly looked up, his gaze locking with hers through the window. Even at this distance, the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Christina quickly turned away, continuing her walk as if she'd merely been passing by. But she could feel his eyes following her until she rounded the corner. Back in her apartment, Christina added a note to her investigation board. Blackwood Timber Company, Dominic Blackwood. She drew a question mark beside it. Then she added another note. Animal attacks? 3 this month? Standing back, she surveyed her meager collection of clues. Somewhere in this town was the answer to what happened to Melissa. Christina could feel it, and something told her that the imposing Dominic Blackwood and his timber company might somehow be connected to the mystery. As she prepared for bed, Christina heard a distant hoe from the surrounding forest, long, mournful, and somehow too close for comfort. She moved to the window, peering out at the dark tree line visible beyond the town's edge. "What happened to you here, Melissa?" she whispered to the night. "And what secrets is this town hiding?" The only answer was another howl. Chapter 2. First Encounter. Christina woke to sunlight streaming through curtains she'd forgotten to close. For a disorienting moment she couldn't place where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the distant sound of a bell tolling, the scent of fresh bread wafting from somewhere below. Then it all came rushing back. Riverwood, Melissa, her self-appointed mission. She checked her phone, 7:42 a.m. No missed calls, no texts. Not that she expected any. She'd left precious few connections behind in Seattle. Her editor had been understanding but firm when she'd resigned. "Take the time you need, Christina, but don't expect your position to be waiting when you get back." After a quick shower in the cramped bathroom, Christina dressed in jeans and a light sweater. She needed to get the lay of the land, establish a routine, and most importantly, start asking subtle questions about her sister. Downstairs, Martha's bookstore was already open, the bell above the door chiming as Christina entered. The space was smaller than it appeared from outside, but every inch was efficiently used. Shelves reaching to the ceiling, comfortable reading nooks tucked into corners, and a small coffee counter near the register. "Good morning," Martha called from behind a stack of books she was unpacking. "Sleep well?" "Like a rock," Christina admitted. "Something about the mountain air, I guess." "It'll do that. Coffee's fresh if you'd like some. On the house for your first day." Christina accepted gratefully, pouring herself a cup from the carafe on the counter. "I thought I'd explore the town today, get my bearings." "Perfect day for it. Farmers' market is set up in the square this morning. Good place to meet folks." Martha hesitated, then added, "If you're looking for the full Riverwood experience, you might want to stop by the Historical Society. Elmer Jenkins runs it, knows more about this town's history than anyone alive." Christina nodded, filing away the information. The Historical Society would be a natural place to ask about old news without raising suspicions. After finishing her coffee and thanking Martha, Christina stepped out into the crisp morning air. Main Street was considerably more active than it had been the previous evening. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks, delivery trucks unloaded supplies, and locals greeted each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd known each other for decades. Christina followed the sounds of the farmers' market, turning onto a side street that opened into a small town square. Wooden stalls displayed local produce, handcrafts, and baked goods. The atmosphere was lively, with children running between stalls and old-timers gathered on benches, observing the activity. She wandered through the market, picking up a few essentials, fresh bread, local honey, some apples that the vendor assured her were the best in the county. Each interaction came with friendly curiosity about the newcomer, which Christina deflected with her write-a-cover story. "Research for a novel," she explained to a cheese vendor who asked what brought her to town. "Something about small-town life and local legends." "Well, you've come to the right place for legends," the woman replied with a knowing smile. "Riverwood's got more than its share of strange tales." "Oh? Like what?" Christina kept her tone casual, selecting a small wedge of sharp cheddar. "The usual mountain town stuff, mysterious lights in the forest, hikers going missing." The woman lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Some folks still claim there's something unnatural about the Blackwood family. Been here since before the town was founded, and they never seem to lose their influence." Christina was about to press for more details when a commotion near the edge of the square caught her attention. A group of men in work clothes had arrived, and the market's energy shifted subtly. Conversations pausing, glances directed their way. At the center of the group was Dominic Blackwood, unmistakable even in daylight. Taller than most around him, with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to command the space around him. His dark hair was shorter on the sides, longer on top, and his jawline could have been carved from stone. He wore a simple flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. Christina found herself staring, journalist's instincts cataloguing details. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, but there was something else, an alertness, almost predatory, in the way his eyes scanned the crowd. Turning back to her shopping, Christina decided to find the Historical Society next. She paid for her cheese, tucking it into her tote bag alongside her other purchases. As she turned to leave, she collided hard with someone who'd appeared behind her. Her bag tumbled to the ground, apples rolling across the cobblestones. Strong hands steadied her before she could fall, gripping her upper arms with surprising warmth. "I'm sorry, I didn't—" Christina looked up and the words died in her throat. Dominic Blackwood's eyes were even more intense up close, a deep amber colour that seemed almost to glow in the morning light. His expression shifted from concern to something unreadable as he studied her face. "You should watch where you're going," he said, his voice deeper than she'd expected, with a roughness that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Christina found her voice. "I believe you were the one behind me," she countered, stepping back from his grip, "but thanks for the catch." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps at her lack of deference. Most people in town seemed to regard him with a mixture of respect and wariness. Christina bent to retrieve her fallen groceries, and after a moment's hesitation, he knelt to help, collecting the scattered apples with efficient movements. "You're new here," he stated rather than asked, handing her the fruit. "Just arrived yesterday. Christina Jones." She offered her hand, a challenge in the gesture. He paused before taking it, his much larger hand enveloping hers. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through her. "Dominic Blackwood. So I've heard. You're something of a local celebrity, Mr. Blackwood." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Hardly. Just a businessman in a small town." He released her hand, but his eyes remained fixed on hers, searching. "What brings you to Riverwood, Miss Jones?" "I'm a writer, looking for inspiration." The lie came easily now with repetition. "Writers usually prefer places with more happening than Riverwood." His tone suggested skepticism. "Sometimes the quietest places hide the most interesting stories." Christina met his gaze steadily. "Don't you find—" Something shifted in his expression, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Riverwood isn't the place for people looking to uncover stories, Miss Jones. Some things are better left alone." The warning was unmistakable, though his tone remained conversational. Christina felt a flutter of both apprehension and excitement. His reaction only confirmed her suspicion that this town, and this man, held secrets. "I'll keep that in mind," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though in my experience warnings like that usually mean I'm looking in exactly the right place." For a moment tension crackled between them. Then one of Dominic's companions approached, a stocky man with a close-cropped beard. "Dom, we need to get going. Logger crews are waiting on the new assignments." Dominic nodded without breaking eye contact with Christina. "Miss Jones, it was interesting meeting you. Enjoy your stay in Riverwood, however long it lasts." He turned to go, then paused. "And I'd recommend staying out of the woods after dark. The wildlife can be unpredictable this time of year." Before Christina could respond, he was striding away, his group falling in around him like a well-practiced formation. She watched them go, noting how others in the market subtly moved aside to let them pass. "I see you've met our local timber baron." Christina turned to find an elderly man observing her with amusement, leaning on a carved walking stick. "Is he always so charming?" she asked dryly. The old man chuckled. "Dominic Blackwood isn't known for his social graces, keeps to himself and his crew mostly." He extended a gnarled hand. "Elmer Jenkins. I run the Historical Society." Christina's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I was just about to look for you, actually. Martha Winters suggested I stop by." "Did she now? Well, come along then. I open at 10 on market days." He gestured toward a side street. "And I might be able to tell you a thing or two about the Blackwoods that you won't hear elsewhere." The Historical Society occupied a small Victorian house a block off Main Street. Inside, the front rooms had been converted to display cases and bookshelves, while maintaining the charm of the original architecture. Photographs of Riverwood through the decades lined the walls, showing the town's evolution from a lumber camp to the small community it was today. Riverwood was founded in 1872, Elmer explained as he unlocked a display case. Though the Blackwood family had already established their timber operation a decade earlier, in many ways, the town grew around their business. Christina examined a sepia photograph showing a group of stern-faced men standing before a timber mill. At the center was a figure who bore a striking resemblance to Dominic. Same commanding posture, same intense gaze. His great-grandfather, Elmer said, noting her interest. The family resemblance is strong. They've maintained their position all this time. The Blackwoods have always been resilient. Elmer selected a leather-bound book from a shelf. They've weathered economic downturns, modernization, environmental regulations, challenges that ruined other timber operations. Some say they have an uncanny connection to the forest itself. Christina's journalistic instincts sharpened. What kind of connection? Elmer's eyes twinkled. Just old mountain superstitions. Every small town has its folklore. He opened the book, revealing more photographs. The interesting thing about the Blackwoods is how they've maintained not just their business but their privacy. The estate is several miles outside town, deep in the forest. Few people ever get invited there. Christina flipped through the pages, pausing at an image of a sprawling stone mansion partially obscured by trees. Is this the estate? Taken in the 1930s. Only clear photograph we have of it. They've added to it over the years, I understand. As Christina continued examining the historical materials, she casually steered the conversation toward more recent history. I heard something about animal attacks recently. Elmer's expression sobered. Ah, yes. We've had some trouble this past month. 3 incidents, all at night, all involving hikers or campers in the national forest that borders Blackwood land. Fatal attacks? 1 death, 2 disappearances. Elmer lowered his voice. Sheriff's official line is mountain lion, but I've lived here 78 years, and I've never known a mountain lion to drag away full-grown adults without leaving a trace. Christina felt a chill. When did these incidents start? First one was about 5 weeks ago. Young woman camping alone, against all good sense. He shook his head sadly. Rangers found her campsite torn apart, blood everywhere, but no body. 5 weeks ago. Christina made a mental note to check if this aligned with any of Melissa's last known movements. Their conversation was interrupted by the jangling of Elmer's phone. He excused himself to answer it, moving to the back room. Christina took the opportunity to examine more of the historical materials, particularly anything related to the Blackwoods or unusual incidents in the town's history. A leather-bound journal in a glass case caught her eye. The display card identified it as Journal of Thomas Winters, 1,897 to 1,898 inches. The name Winters made her pause. Martha's family, perhaps? The journal was open to a page with a detailed sketch of what appeared to be a large wolf, but with proportions that seemed exaggerated, almost human-like in some aspects. Beneath it was written, "Another sighting near Blackwood territory. D insists they are protecting us, but from what? The attacks only occur when outsiders venture too close to their land." Christina was leaning closer to read more when Elmer returned, his expression troubled. "I'm afraid I need to close early today," he said, his earlier friendliness replaced with sudden reserve. "Family matter." Christina straightened, gesturing to the journal. "Of course. I was just looking at this interesting entry." "That's just old nonsense," Elmer interrupted, moving to usher her toward the door. "Thomas Winters was known for embellishing his accounts. Too much moonshine, most likely." The abrupt change in Elmer's demeanor was jarring. As they reached the door, Christina noticed his gaze fixed on something outside. Following his line of sight, she saw Dominic Blackwood standing across the street, staring directly at the Historical Society building. When he saw Christina, his expression darkened. "You should head back to town now," Elmer said quietly. "And Miss Jones, Be careful about the questions you ask in Riverwood. Not everyone appreciates curiosity." Before she could respond, he had closed the door behind her, the lock clicking firmly into place. Christina stood on the sidewalk, processing the strange interaction. Across the street, Dominic was now engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation on his phone, his back turned to her. As she watched, he suddenly stiffened, his head snapping up to look toward the distant tree line visible above the rooftops. Without finishing his call, he pocketed his phone and strode purposefully toward his truck parked nearby. As he climbed in, his gaze met Christina's once more across the distance, and this time there was something almost like concern in his expression. The truck roared to life and pulled away with urgency, heading in the direction of the forest. Christina stood watching until it disappeared from view, the encounter with both Elmer and Dominic leaving her with far more questions than answers. One thing was becoming increasingly clear. Whatever secrets Riverwood held, Dominic Blackwood was at the center of them. And somehow, Christina suspected, so was her sister's disappearance. Chapter 3. The Attack. 3 days in Riverwood had yielded frustratingly little concrete information about Melissa. Christina had established a routine: mornings at the local cafe with her laptop, afternoons exploring different parts of town, and evenings compiling notes in her apartment. She'd casually mentioned her missing friend to several locals, but reactions ranged from polite disinterest to obvious discomfort. The town library became her sanctuary. Housed in a converted church with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows, it offered both atmosphere and resources. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Helen, had been surprisingly helpful once Christina explained her research needs. "Local newspapers going back to the 1920s? Helen had said, leading her to a room in the back where microfilm readers sat alongside filing cabinets. "Not digitized, I'm afraid. We're a small operation." Christina didn't mind. Physical records were harder to alter or delete. She'd spent hours scrolling through old news looking for patterns, disappearances, unusual deaths, anything that might connect to the recent animal attacks or her sister. Tonight she'd lost track of time. The library officially closed at 8, but Helen had left her with a key to the side door. "Just lock up when you're done," she'd said with a conspiratorial smile. "I was young and curious once too." The clock on the wall read 10:37 p.m. when Christina finally stretched, her back protesting after hours hunched over the microfilm reader. She'd found something interesting, a pattern of disappearances every few decades, always dismissed as hikers lost in the vast wilderness surrounding Riverwood. The most recent cluster had been about 30 years ago. She carefully returned the materials to their proper places and gathered her notes. The library was eerily silent, the tall windows now dark mirrors reflecting the interior lights. Christina switched everything off, plunging the building into darkness except for the emergency exit signs casting a red glow over the main hall. Outside, Riverwood was quiet. Most businesses on Main Street had closed hours ago, though the diner and a bar at the far end still showed signs of life. The night air had a bite to it, and Christina pulled her jacket tighter, wishing she'd brought something warmer. The walk to her apartment wasn't long, just 6 blocks, but the streets were poorly lit once she left Main Street. Christina quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. She'd never been one to scare easily, but something about the pressing darkness of the surrounding forest made her uneasy. 3 blocks from home, Christina became aware of footsteps behind her, light, quick, almost too faint to hear. She glanced back but saw only shadows. The street light at the corner flickered, buzzing with electrical protest. "Get it together, Jones," she muttered to herself. "Small-town paranoia is getting to you." She turned the corner onto Maple Street and froze. A figure stood directly in her path, motionless under the dim glow of a distant streetlight. For a moment, Christina thought it might be Dominic. The height and build were similar. But as the figure took a step forward, she realized her mistake. This man was leaner, with pale hair that seemed almost white in the darkness. He wore a long coat despite the mild evening, and something about his posture seemed unnaturally still. "Excuse me," Christina said firmly, moving to walk around him. "Christina Jones." The man's voice was soft, almost musical, with an accent she couldn't place. The curious newcomer. Christina stopped, alarm bells ringing in her mind. "Do I know you?" "Not yet." His smile revealed teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "But I've heard so much about you, the town's latest attraction." He took another step toward her, moving with an odd fluidity that made Christina's skin crawl. Her instincts screamed danger. "I'm expected at home," she said, reaching into her pocket for her phone. "My friends are waiting." "No one is waiting for you," he replied, his smile widening. "Just as no one waited for your sister." Christina's blood ran cold. "What do you know about my sister?" Melissa was delicious company. He inhaled deeply, as if savouring a scent. "You share her blood. I can smell it." Christina backed away, her phone now in hand, though she doubted there would be reception. The stranger matched her movements, maintaining the distance between them with predatory patience. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just a taste." His eyes caught the streetlight, reflecting it back with an unnatural red gleam. "Melissa gave so willingly in the end. Will you?" Christina turned and ran. She made it perhaps 20 feet before something slammed into her from behind, sending her sprawling onto the pavement. Her phone skittered away into the darkness. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and before she could recover, she was flipped onto her back, the stranger looming over her. Up close, his features were beautiful but wrong somehow, too perfect, too angular. His eyes were definitely red now, not a reflection but an internal glow that pulsed with hunger. "I do love when they run," he whispered, his cold hand closing around her throat. "The fear makes the blood sweeter." Christina struggled, kicking and clawing, but his strength was impossible, like fighting against steel cables. He lowered his face toward her neck, and she felt something sharp graze her skin. A low, rumbling growl cut through the night. The stranger's head snapped up, his grip loosening slightly. Christina followed his gaze to the darkened yard across the street, where two glowing eyes reflected the streetlight, eyes set much higher than any normal animal's would be. "Blackwood," the stranger hissed, his face contorting with hatred. From the shadows emerged the largest wolf Christina had ever seen. No, larger than any wolf could possibly be. Its shoulders stood as high as a man's chest, its massive head crowned with pointed ears that lay flat against its skull. Black fur bristled along its spine, and its lips were pulled back to reveal fangs that gleamed white in the darkness. The stranger released Christina, rising to face this new threat. "This doesn't concern you, dog. The woman is mine." The wolf's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the pavement beneath Christina. It took a deliberate step forward, placing itself between her and the attacker. "You're trespassing, leech," the stranger said, his posture shifting to something more defensive. "The treaty?" The wolf lunged without warning, a blur of midnight fur and flashing teeth. The stranger moved with inhuman speed, evading the initial attack, but the wolf pivoted with impossible agility for its size, jaws snapping at the man's arm. Christina scrambled backward, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The two creatures fought with supernatural speed and strength, the wolf's massive paws swiping with bone-crushing force, the stranger moving like liquid shadow, his hands now ending in claw-like nails that left glowing scratches in the wolf's hide. "Run." The command slammed into Christina's mind with such force that she wasn't sure if she'd heard it or imagined it. The wolf's eyes met hers for a split second, amber eyes, familiar somehow, before it returned to the fight. Christina staggered to her feet but found herself unable to flee. The stranger had maneuvered himself between her and the route home. The wolf seemed to be trying to drive him in the opposite direction, toward the forest edge. Blood now matted the wolf's fur where the stranger's claws had connected, but the creature fought with undiminished ferocity. It caught the pale man's leg in its jaws, and Christina heard a sickening crunch. The stranger howled, a sound no human throat could produce, and struck the wolf across the muzzle with enough force to send it skidding across the pavement. For a moment, both combatants paused, assessing, The stranger's leg hung at an unnatural angle, but even as Christina watched, it began to straighten, the bones visibly realigning beneath the torn fabric of his pants. The wolf shook its massive head, blood dripping from a gash above its eye, but its gaze remained locked on its opponent. "Another night, then," the stranger said, his voice now distorted, less human. "But the girl is marked. She belongs to us now." The wolf's answering roar shook the windows of nearby houses. It charged again, but this time the stranger leapt, not away, but up, clearing a 2-story building in a single bound before disappearing over the rooftops. The wolf skidded to a stop, head tilted upward, tracking its escaped prey. A low, frustrated growl rumbled from its chest. Then, slowly, it turned toward Christina. She pressed herself against a tree trunk, heart hammering. The wolf approached cautiously, its massive paws silent on the pavement. Up close it was even more terrifying, shoulders broader than a bear's, legs thick with muscle, head large enough to engulf her own in a single bite. But those eyes... Dominic! The name escaped her lips before she could stop it. The wolf froze, amber eyes widening with what could only be described as shock. It took a step back, then another, shaking its massive head as if in denial. A door opened down the street, someone investigating the commotion. The wolf's head snapped toward the sound, ears pricked forward. When it looked back at Christina, there was something almost apologetic in its gaze. Then it was gone, bounding away with impossible speed toward the forest edge, leaving Christina alone and shaking in the middle of the deserted street. "Hello? Is someone there?" a man's voice called, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight sweeping the area. Christina couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her mind replayed the impossible scene, the stranger's inhuman strength, his red eyes, the way he'd spoken of tasting her blood, the massive wolf that had saved her, with eyes that reminded her of... "Miss, are you all right?" The flashlight beam found her, and footsteps hurried in her direction. An older man in a bathrobe approached, concern etched on his face. "Good Lord, you're bleeding!" Christina touched her neck where the stranger's teeth had grazed her skin. Her fingers came away with a smear of blood. I fell," she managed, the lie automatic. "Tripped on the sidewalk." The man looked skeptical, glancing around at the clearly disturbed scene, pavement gouged with claw marks, blood spatters that couldn't possibly be explained by a simple fall. "Let me call the sheriff," he said, reaching for his phone. "No!" Christina's response was too quick, too forceful. She moderated her tone. "No, thank you. I live just up the street. I'll clean up at home." "At least let me walk you—" "I'm fine, really." Christina forced a smile, already backing away. "Thank you for your concern." She turned and hurried toward her apartment, aware of the man watching her go. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. Vampires weren't real. Werewolves weren't real. And yet, the stranger had known Melissa, had implied he'd done something to her. And the wolf, if it was somehow Dominic, as her instincts insisted, had protected her with a ferocity that went beyond any normal sense of duty. Christina's hands shook as she unlocked her apartment door. Inside, she double-bolted it behind her and moved methodically through the small space, checking windows, drawing curtains, turning on every light. Only then did she examine her neck in the bathroom mirror. 2 shallow punctures marked her skin, already clotting. Not deep enough to be dangerous, but unmistakable in their intent. The stranger, the vampire, had barely begun what he'd intended to do. She cleaned the wound carefully, applying antiseptic and a bandage. Her reflection looked pale, eyes too wide, but her hands had stopped shaking. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by the analytical mindset that had made her a good journalist. Christina returned to her investigation board and added new notes with a steady hand. Pale stranger, new Melissa vampire, massive black wolf, protected me, Dominic. Treaty mentioned between them. She stepped back, studying the connections. If the supernatural was real, if vampires and werewolves actually existed, Then the pattern of disappearances, the animal attacks, the Blackwood family's enduring influence. It all took on a different meaning. A soft tap at her window made her jump, heart racing again. Christina approached cautiously, peering through a gap in the curtains. Dominic Blackwood stood in the street below, looking up at her window. He was fully dressed despite the late hour, his dark hair damp as if from a recent shower. When he saw her, he raised a hand in a clear gesture. "Come down." Christina hesitated. If her wild theory was correct, this man had just transformed from an enormous wolf back to human form after fighting a vampire to protect her. The rational part of her brain insisted she should be terrified, should call the police, should barricade herself inside. Instead, she found herself moving toward the door. Whatever Dominic Blackwood was, he had saved her life tonight, and he might have answers about Melissa. As she descended the stairs to the street, Christina touched the bandage on her neck. The stranger had said she was marked now. Whatever that meant, she had a feeling her quiet research phase in Riverwood had just come to an abrupt end. Chapter 4. Questions and Lies. Dominic was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when Christina emerged from the bookstore's side entrance. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp angles of his jaw and cheekbones. His posture was rigid, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his leather jacket. "You should be resting," he said by way of greeting, his voice rough. "You've had a shock." Christina crossed her arms, suddenly aware she was wearing only a thin sweater against the night chill. "I've had more than a shock, Mr. Blackwood. I've had an education." His expression tightened. "Let's not do this on the street. May I come up?" "So you can what? Threaten me? Tell me I imagined everything?" Despite her words, Christina stepped aside, gesturing toward the stairs. "After you." Dominic hesitated, then moved past her, climbing the stairs with silent grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. Christina followed, noting the careful distance he maintained between them. Inside her apartment, the investigation board was still visible, her new notes prominently displayed. Christina made no move to hide it as she closed the door behind them. Dominic's gaze swept the room, lingering on the board before settling back on her with newfound wariness. "You're not just a writer," he stated flatly. "And you're not just a businessman." Christina leaned against the door, keeping the exit at her back. "Former investigative journalist, if you're curious. Seattle Tribune." "Former?" "I resigned to find my sister." She watched his reaction carefully. "Melissa Jones. She disappeared about a year ago. Last known location? Riverwood." Something flickered across Dominic's face. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. He moved to the window, looking out at the darkened street as if checking for observers. "I'm sorry about your sister," he said finally. "But what happened tonight has nothing to do with her disappearance. The man who attacked me mentioned her by name, said she was delicious company." Christina's voice remained steady despite the chill that ran through her at the memory. "So forgive me if I don't believe you." Dominic turned back to face her, his expression grave. "What you encountered tonight was a disturbed individual. This area has problems with methamphetamine production in the remote parts of the forest. Users can become delusional, violent." Christina let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Meth users don't have glowing red eyes, they can't leap over buildings, and they certainly don't talk about drinking blood. You were terrified, in shock. The human mind—" "Don't!" Christina cut him off sharply. "Don't insult my intelligence with that gaslighting bullshit. I know what I saw." She stepped closer to him, refusing to be intimidated by his height. "Just like I know what I saw come to my rescue." Dominic's jaw tightened. "And what exactly do you think you saw?" "A wolf. Biggest I've ever seen. Impossibly big, actually." She held his gaze. "With your eyes." The silence between them stretched, electric with tension. Dominic's breathing had quickened slightly, the only visible sign of his discomfort. "That's absurd," he said finally, but the denial lacked conviction. "Is it?" Christina reached up slowly, telegraphing her movement, and pushed aside the collar of his jacket. A fresh, partially healed gash was visible at the junction of his neck and shoulder, exactly where the wolf had been wounded. This should have needed stitches, yet it's already healing. Dominic caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. You're treading in dangerous territory, Christina. I've been in dangerous territory since I arrived in Riverwood. She didn't pull away from his hold. The difference is now I know it. His thumb moved almost unconsciously over her pulse point, and Christina became acutely aware of their proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice lower now. The truth. About you. About the man who attacked me. About this town. She swallowed. About my sister. Dominic released her wrist and stepped back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. The truth isn't simple and it isn't safe. Try me. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. The man who attacked you is dangerous, more dangerous than you can imagine. He's part of a group that's been encroaching on Riverwood territory recently. Territory, Christina repeated. You mean your territory? Dominic's eyes narrowed. Yes. Because you protect this town. As what? Werewolves? The word hung in the air between them. Dominic's expression remained carefully neutral, but Christina could see the calculation behind his eyes, the consideration of how much to reveal. We prefer the term shifters, he said finally. Werewolf comes with certain Hollywood misconceptions. Despite having suspected it, having the supernatural confirmed so bluntly made Christina's knees weaken. She moved to the small kitchen table and sat down, needing the support. So it's true, all of it. She looked up at him. And the man who attacked me? Vampire, Dominic said, the word coming out like a curse. One of a coven that's been trying to establish itself in the region. We've had a treaty with the older covens for generations. They stay out of our territory. We leave them to their hunting grounds elsewhere. Hunting grounds? Christina felt sick. You mean people? Humans? Dominic's expression hardened. We protect our territory. What happens beyond our borders isn't our concern. How noble of you, Christina said, anger flaring. So my sister, what, wandered into the wrong hunting ground? I don't know what happened to your sister, Dominic insisted, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't being entirely truthful. But if she encountered vampires and they took an interest in her. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Christina pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to process the implications. When she looked up again, her journalist's instincts had reasserted themselves. The animal attacks. That was vampires. Dominic nodded. They're getting bolder, coming closer to town, breaking the old agreements. And the Blackwood family has always been what you are. For as long as we've existed. The first Blackwood was born a shifter. We've protected this territory since before European settlers arrived. Christina's mind raced with questions. How many of you are there? My pack number's 23, all employees of Blackwood Timber officially. The entire company? No, we have human employees too. Most don't know what we are, though some suspect. Dominic moved to sit across from her at the table, his large frame making the chair seem child-sized. Which brings me to why I'm here. You can't tell anyone what you saw tonight. Christina raised an eyebrow. Or what? You'll silence me. Anger flashed across Dominic's face. We don't harm humans. Ever. It's our most sacred law. Then why the warning? Because others might. His voice softened slightly. The vampires now know you're under my protection. That makes you a target, a way to provoke me, to force a conflict. Under your protection, Christina echoed. I don't recall asking for that. You didn't have to. Dominic leaned forward, his intensity almost palpable. The moment I intervened, I accepted responsibility for your safety. That's how our world works. Your world, Christina corrected, not mine. You're in it now, whether you like it or not. He gestured to her neck, where the bandage covered the vampire's marks. He tasted your blood. That creates a connection. He can track you now, sense your presence. Christina's hand went instinctively to the bandage. That's horrifying. It's reality. Dominic's expression was grim. Which is why you need to leave Riverwood. Go back to Seattle or anywhere far from here. I can arrange protection until you're safely away. I'm not going anywhere, Christina said firmly. Not without answers about Melissa. Your sister is gone, Dominic said, his bluntness clearly intentional. If vampires took her, there's nothing left to find. You don't know that for certain. I know enough. His frustration was evident. Why are you being so stubborn about this? I'm trying to save your life. Because she's my sister. Christina's composure finally cracked. Because I promised our parents before they died that I'd always look out for her. Because I can't just abandon her to monsters without even trying to learn the truth. The outburst left her breathing hard, eyes burning with unshed tears. Dominic watched her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. I understand loyalty to family, he said quietly. It's the foundation of pack life. But sometimes, Christina, the price of that loyalty is too high. Not for me. She wiped angrily at her eyes. And if you won't help me, I'll find answers on my own. Dominic stood abruptly, pacing the small apartment with barely contained energy. You're impossible, reckless. Do you have any idea what vampires are capable of? What they do to humans who learn too much? Probably similar to what werewolves, shifters do, Christina countered, rising to face him. He whirled on her, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. We protect, they destroy. Don't ever confuse the two. They were inches apart now. Domin, I see, looming over her, his amber eyes flashing with anger and something else, something wilder, more primal. Christina should have been terrified, but instead she felt a rush of heat that had nothing to do with fear. Then prove it, she challenged, her voice dropping lower. Protect me by helping me find the truth about Melissa. Dominic's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, anger and attraction impossibly tangled together. You have no idea what you're asking, he said, his voice rough. I'm asking for the truth, for justice for my sister. Christina didn't back down. And I think part of you wants to give me that. His hand came up to her face, fingers hovering just shy of touching her cheek. What I want, he began, then stopped himself, dropping his hand. What I want doesn't matter. Pack comes first. Always. The moment shattered. Dominic stepped back, his expression closing off again. I can't help you investigate your sister's disappearance. It would put my pack at risk. Then I'll do it alone, Christina said, disappointment and determination warring within her. You'll get yourself killed. He moved toward the door. At least promise me you'll stay in town, in public places. Don't go into the woods alone, especially not at night. Are you actually concerned for my safety or just worried I'll stumble onto more of your secrets? Dominic paused at the door, his back to her. Both, he admitted. But mostly the former. He turned to face her one last time, his expression troubled. The vampire who attacked you, he'll be back. They don't give up once they've marked someone. Stay vigilant. I always am. Dominic nodded, then hesitated. For what it's worth, I am sorry about your sister. No one deserves that fate. Before Christina could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She moved to lock it, then leaned her forehead against the cool wood, exhaling slowly. The world had shifted beneath her feet tonight. Vampires. Werewolves. No, shifters. Her sister, likely dead at the hands of monsters she'd thought existed only in fiction. And Dominic Blackwood, the alpha werewolf who'd saved her life and then tried to drive her away. Christina touched her fingers to her cheek where Dominic had almost caressed her. The attraction between them was undeniable, inappropriate, and completely inconvenient. She couldn't afford to be distracted from her purpose here, finding the truth about Melissa. And yet, as she returned to her investigation board and added new information from their conversation, Christina couldn't help but wonder about the conflict she'd seen in Dominic's eyes. He was hiding something about Melissa, she was certain of it. but he'd also risked his life to save her from the vampire. "What are you not telling me, Dominic Blackwood?" she murmured, staring at his name on her board. "And why do I feel like it changes everything?" Chapter 5. Discovery. Morning light filtered through Christina's curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with revelations and questions. The supernatural was real. Her sister had likely encountered vampires. And Dominic Blackwood, the man who'd saved her life, could transform into an enormous wolf. She touched the bandage on her neck, wincing at the tenderness beneath. The vampire's bite was a constant reminder that this wasn't some elaborate hallucination. After a quick shower, Christina dressed in practical clothes, jeans, hiking boots, and a warm flannel shirt. If she was going to continue her investigation in a town surrounded by supernatural predators, she needed to be prepared for anything. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from an unknown number. No voicemails. Christina frowned, wondering if Dominic was trying to contact her. She hadn't given him her number, but that probably wouldn't stop an alpha werewolf with local connections. Downstairs, Martha's bookstore was already open. The older woman looked up from arranging a display as Christina entered. "Good morning, dear. You're up early." Martha's smile faltered as she noticed the bandage on Christina's neck. "Oh my, what happened?" Christina touched the covering self-consciously. "Just a scratch. Caught myself on a branch while walking last night." Martha's expression suggested she didn't quite believe this explanation, but she didn't press. "Well, be careful out there. The forest can be treacherous after dark." "So I've discovered." Christina hesitated, then asked, "Martha, does the name Melissa Jones mean anything to you? She would have been in town about a year ago." Martha's brow furrowed in concentration. "Jones. Not a common name around here, but not unusual either. Was she a relative?" "My sister." "Oh." Martha's eyes widened with recognition. "Yes, I do remember a young woman asking about local history books. Pretty girl, looked a bit like you around the eyes. She mentioned researching old folklore for a podcast, I think." Christina's heart quickened. This was the first confirmation that Melissa had definitely been in Riverwood. "Did she say anything about where she was staying? Or what specifically she was researching?" "She didn't mention accommodations, but she was particularly interested in local legends, especially anything about the Blackwood family and the old stories about forest guardians." Martha lowered her voice conspiratorially. She also asked about the disappearances. "Disappearances?" "Every few decades we have a spate of missing persons, usually outsiders, hikers or campers. Most folks blame it on the wilderness, but there are older stories." Martha trailed off, looking suddenly uncomfortable. "Listen to me. Gossiping like old Elmer. Your sister probably just moved on to the next town for her research. These small mountain communities are full of similar legends." Christina nodded, not wanting to alarm Martha with too much interest. "Probably. Thanks for remembering her, though. It helps." "Of course, dear. Oh, speaking of research..." Martha disappeared behind the counter and emerged with a stack of local newspapers. "These came in yesterday. The Riverwood Gazette only publishes weekly, but they keep archives at the office. Might be useful for your book." Christina accepted the papers gratefully. "This is perfect. Thank you." Back in her apartment, Christina spread the newspapers across her table. Most were recent editions, but Martha had included several from the previous year, around the time Melissa would have been in town. She scanned the headlines methodically, looking for anything unusual. Most stories were mundane small-town news, council meetings, high school sports, business openings and closings. But in an edition from 11 months ago, a small article caught her eye. "Search continues for missing hiker." Local authorities continue to search for Melissa Jones, 27, last seen at the Pinecrest Trailhead 2 weeks ago. Jones, a podcaster from Seattle researching local folklore, was reported missing when she failed to check out of the Riverwood Inn. Her vehicle was discovered in the trailhead parking area, with her belongings still inside. Sheriff Tanner urges anyone with information to contact the department immediately. Christina stared at the article, her hands trembling slightly. Here was proof, official confirmation that Melissa had disappeared in Riverwood and that authorities had searched for her. Yet in all her inquiries with the Seattle police and even calls to the county sheriff's office, no one had mentioned this. Someone had deliberately buried the investigation. She carefully cut out the article and pinned it to her investigation board. Then she continued through the remaining papers, finding 2 follow-up pieces. One announcing the search was being scaled back after a week with no leads, and a final notice that the case remained open but active search operations had been suspended. The last article included a quote from Sheriff Tanner. "While we have found no evidence of foul play, the wilderness around Riverwood can be unforgiving to those unfamiliar with it. Our thoughts are with Miss Jones's family." Christina's jaw clenched in anger. No evidence of foul play. After what she now knew about vampires in the area, that statement seemed either willfully ignorant or deliberately misleading. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number listed for the sheriff's office. After 3 rings, a woman answered. "Riverwood Sheriff's Department. How can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Sheriff Tanner about a missing persons case from last year," Christina said, keeping her voice steady. "Melissa Jones." A pause. "May I ask who's calling?" "Christina Jones, her sister." Another longer pause. "1 moment, please." The line went silent for nearly a minute before a gruff male voice came on. "This is Sheriff Tanner. You're Melissa Jones's sister?" "Yes, I'm in Riverwood, looking into her disappearance." "I see." His tone was carefully neutral. "Miss Jones, I understand your concern, but we conducted a thorough investigation at the time. Sometimes people who go into those woods don't come out. No signs of foul play were found." "I'd like to see the case file," Christina pressed, "and I want to know why no one contacted me as next of kin. According to our records, attempts were made to contact family members. If you didn't receive notification, I apologize for that oversight." The sheriff's voice hardened slightly. "As for the case file, you're welcome to submit a formal request. But I should warn you that the investigation is technically still open, which limits what we can share." "I'll be there this afternoon to make that request in person," Christina said firmly. "I'm afraid I'm headed out of town for a law enforcement conference. Won't be back until Monday." The convenient timing wasn't lost on Christina. "My deputy can take your information, though." After ending the call, Christina paced her small apartment, frustration building. The sheriff was clearly stonewalling her. But why? Was he simply incompetent, or was there something more sinister at work? Did he know about the supernatural elements in his town? She returned to her investigation board, adding the sheriff's name with a question mark beside it. Then she gathered her research materials and headed out. If official channels were going to obstruct her, she'd need to find answers elsewhere. The Riverwood Inn where Melissa had stayed was a 2-story Victorian building at the edge of town. Christina pushed through the front door into a cozy lobby with a stone fireplace and antique furniture. The woman at the reception desk looked up with a practiced smile. "Welcome to the Riverwood Inn. Can I help you?" "I hope so," Christina said, approaching the desk. "My name is Christina Jones. My sister Melissa stayed here about a year ago before she went missing." The receptionist's smile faltered. "Oh, the hiker who disappeared. Yes, I remember. I'm trying to retrace her steps. Is there any chance you remember anything about her stay? Who she talked to, what she asked about?" The woman, her name tag read Diane, glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I shouldn't really discuss guests, but it was such a sad situation." She lowered her voice. "Melissa stayed for nearly a week. Kept to herself mostly, but she was friendly. Asked a lot of questions about local legends, especially anything to do with the forest." "Did she mention where she was planning to hike?" "She talked about the Pinecrest Trail, said she wanted to see the old mining ruins up there." Diane hesitated. But the night before she disappeared, she was excited about something else. Said she'd found evidence of what she was looking for, that it would blow the lid off everything. Those were her exact words. Christina's pulse quickened. Did she say what she'd found? No, but Diane leaned closer. She had a map with markings on it. I noticed when she spread it out on the lobby table. There was a circle around an area deep in the forest, well off any marked trails. When I warned her it was dangerous territory, she just smiled and said sometimes the truth was worth the risk. Do you remember where on the map? Diane shook her head. Not exactly. Somewhere north of Blackwood property, I think, near the old Holloway mine. Christina thanked the receptionist and left, her mind racing. Melissa had found something significant enough that she'd ventured into remote wilderness to investigate further, and shortly after, she'd vanished. The local library was her next stop. Christina headed straight for the map section, where she found detailed topographical charts of the surrounding forest. She located the Holloway mine, an abandoned silver operation from the early 1900s, and the Blackwood property boundaries. The area between them was rugged, marked with steep ravines and dense forest. As she studied the map, Christina noticed something interesting. The territory north of Blackwood land formed a rough semicircle around a feature labelled Crescent Valley. The name triggered a memory from her research, something about old settler accounts of strange lights and unexplained disappearances in that area. Finding everything okay? Helen, the librarian, appeared beside her. Yes, thanks. Just looking at the local geography. Christina pointed to Crescent Valley. Is this area accessible? By hiking, I mean. Helen frowned. Technically, but it's treacherous terrain. No maintained trails and the old mining roads washed out decades ago. Plus, there's been talk of mountain lion activity up there recently. She studied Christina with concern. You're not planning an expedition, are you? Just research, Christina assured her. For my book. After photographing the relevant maps with her phone, Christina left the library and headed toward the diner for a late lunch. Her mind was piecing together a theory. Melissa had discovered something about vampires, perhaps evidence of their hunting grounds or a nest, and had gone to investigate. If Crescent Valley was vampire territory, it would explain why Dominic had been so adamant that she stay away from the forest. The diner was nearly empty at mid-afternoon. Christina slid into a booth and ordered coffee and a sandwich, spreading her notes on the table while she waited. She was so absorbed in her research that she didn't notice the man who entered until he was standing beside her table. Mind if I join you? Christina looked up, startled. The man was tall and lean, with dark hair and striking features. He wasn't from Riverwood. She would have remembered seeing someone so distinctive around town. I'm sorry, do I know you? She asked, subtly gathering her notes. Not yet. His smile didn't reach his eyes. But I know you, Christina Jones. You've been asking questions about your sister. Warning bells rang in Christina's mind. She glanced around the diner. Only the cook and waitress were visible, both in the kitchen area. The man slid into the seat across from her without waiting for permission. Who are you? Christina demanded, her hand moving to her bag where she kept a small canister of pepper spray. A friend of a friend, he said vaguely. Someone who might have information about Melissa. What kind of information? The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. She found something she wasn't supposed to find. Went places humans aren't welcome. Christina's blood ran cold at the word humans. A deliberate choice that confirmed her suspicions. This man was either a vampire or connected to them. What did she find? Christina kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Why don't I show you? He smiled again, revealing teeth that seemed just slightly too sharp. I can take you there now, to the last place your sister was seen. I think I'll pass. Christina began gathering her things. But thanks for the offer. The man's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. I insist! Christina reacted instantly, throwing her hot coffee directly into his face. He recoiled with a hiss of pain, releasing her. She bolted from the booth, heading for the door. Help! She shouted toward the kitchen. Call the police! The waitress emerged, confusion on her face. What's going on? That man! Christina turned to point, but the booth was empty. The man had vanished. Outside, Christina ran down Main Street, not slowing until she reached the town square. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone. No reception. Of course. She looked around wildly, trying to spot the man, but the square was occupied only by a few elderly residents and a mother with a stroller. The encounter had left her badly shaken. The man had clearly been connected to the vampires, possibly one himself, though he hadn't shown the same obvious signs as her attacker from the previous night. Christina needed help, and there was only one person in Riverwood who could provide it. She headed toward the Blackwood Timber Company office with determined strides. The receptionist looked up as Christina entered. "Can I help you?" "I need to see Dominic Blackwood. It's urgent." "Mr. Blackwood is in a meeting. If you'd like to make an appointment, tell him Christina Jones is here, and tell him it's about vampires." The receptionist's eyes widened, her professional demeanor cracking momentarily. I don't... It's all right, Sarah." Dominic's deep voice came from the doorway behind the reception desk. He stood there, expression grim, as if he'd sensed Christina's arrival. "Miss Jones, come in." Christina followed him through to a spacious office dominated by a large wooden desk and a wall of windows overlooking the forest. Two men were already in the room. One she recognized as the bearded man from the farmer's market, the other younger with a watchful intensity about him. "Leave us," Dominic said quietly. The men nodded and exited without question, though the younger one gave Christina a curious glance as he passed. When the door closed, Dominic turned to her. "What happened?" Christina explained the encounter at the diner, then her discoveries about Melissa, the newspaper articles, the information from the inn, and the mysterious Crescent Valley. "I think she found evidence of vampire activity," Christina concluded, "and I think that's why she disappeared." Dominic's expression had darkened progressively as she spoke. "Crescent Valley is dangerous territory. It's beyond our borders in unclaimed land between pack territory and the old vampire hunting grounds." Then I was right. Christina felt a hollow victory. The man at the diner, he was one of them, wasn't he? "Most likely, or a human who serves them." Dominic moved to the windows, staring out at the forest. "They're getting bolder, approaching you in broad daylight in town. He said he could show me where Melissa was last seen." Christina's voice caught slightly. "That means they know what happened to her." Dominic turned back to face her, his expression softening slightly. "Christina, you need to understand something. If your sister encountered vampires, especially in their territory—" "I know what it likely means," she interrupted. "But I need to know for certain. I need closure, at least." Dominic studied her for a long moment, conflict evident in his eyes. Finally he sighed. "The pack is meeting tonight. We've been tracking increased vampire activity for weeks. I'll bring your information to them." "I want to be there," Christina said immediately. "Absolutely not. Pack meetings are for pack only. I get it." Christina stepped closer to him, refusing to be intimidated. "But this is about my sister, and now they're targeting me too. I deserve to be part of this conversation." Dominic ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're the most stubborn human I've ever met." "I'll take that as a compliment." Despite the gravity of the situation, a hint of a smile tugged at Dominic's lips. "It wasn't intended as one." He sighed again. "Fine, I'll pick you up at 8. But understand this, my word is law among the pack. If I tell you to leave, you leave. If I tell you to stay silent, you stay silent." "Understood," Christina agreed, though they both knew she was unlikely to follow orders blindly. As she turned to go, Dominic called after her. "Christina!" She paused at the door. "Don't go anywhere alone until I come for you. Stay in public places, preferably indoors. The vampire who marked you is still hunting." The reminder sent a chill down her spine. "I'll be careful. See that you are." His tone softened almost imperceptibly. "I won't always be there to save you." "Maybe next time," Christina replied with more confidence than she felt. "I'll be the one saving you." As she left the Blackwood office, Christina couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Tonight she would meet a pack of werewolves, shifters, and move one step closer to discovering her sister's fate. And perhaps, though she tried not to dwell on it, one step closer to understanding the enigmatic alpha who had, against all logic, begun to occupy her thoughts far more than was wise. Chapter 6. Revelations. Dusk settled over Riverwood, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and blue. Christina paced her apartment, checking her watch every few minutes. 7:45. Dominic would arrive soon to take her to the pack meeting, a gathering she'd practically forced her way into. She'd spent the afternoon preparing, compiling everything she knew about Melissa's disappearance and the supernatural elements at play. Her investigation board had grown considerably, with red string connecting seemingly disparate elements: Melissa's last known locations, vampire sightings, the Crescent Valley area, and the Blackwood family's territorial boundaries. A soft knock at her door made her jump. Christina checked through the peephole before opening it, half expecting to see the vampire from the diner. Instead, Dominic stood in the hallway, his tall frame filling the doorway. He wore dark jeans and a charcoal Henley that emphasized his broad shoulders, looking more casual than she'd seen him before. "You're early," she said, stepping back to let him in. "Precaution." His eyes swept the apartment, assessing. "I wanted to make sure you were safe." Christina gestured to her investigation board. "I've been busy." Dominic approached the board, studying it with a frown. His gaze lingered on the map where she'd marked Crescent Valley and the surrounding areas. "You've been thorough," he admitted reluctantly, "but there are connections you're missing. That's why I need your help." Christina grabbed her jacket and a small backpack. "I'm ready when you are." Dominic turned to face her, his expression serious. "Before we go, I need to be clear about something. What you'll hear tonight, what you'll see, it can't leave the pack. Our survival depends on secrecy." "I understand." "Do you?" His voice deepened slightly. "Because your instinct as a journalist will be to expose the truth. But in this case, the truth endangers lives, human and shifter alike." Christina met his gaze steadily. "I'm not here as a journalist. I'm here as Melissa's sister." Dominic studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Let's go." Outside, his truck waited at the curb. A black Ford F-150, powerful and practical. Christina climbed into the passenger seat, noting the immaculate interior. As they drove through town, Dominic remained silent, his focus on the road and their surroundings. Christina sensed his tension in the rigid set of his shoulders and the way his eyes constantly scanned the darkening streets. "You're worried about an attack," she observed. "The vampire who marked you won't give up easily." Dominic's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "And now you've encountered another of their kind. They know you're investigating. They want to stop me from finding out what happened to Melissa. Or they want to use you to get to me." Dominic glanced at her. "Either way, you're in danger." They left the town behind, following a winding road into the forest. After several miles, Dominic turned onto a private drive marked only by a small wooden sign bearing the Blackwood Company logo. The paved road gave way to gravel, then dirt, as they ventured deeper into the woods. Finally, they emerged into a clearing where a large log cabin stood, windows glowing with warm light. Several vehicles were already parked nearby, trucks similar to Dominic's, a few SUVs, and a motorcycle. "The pack house," Dominic explained as he parked, "built by my great-grandfather. It's where we gather for important meetings and celebrations." As they approached the cabin, the door opened before they reached it. A woman stood in the doorway, tall and athletic, with copper-coloured hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her eyes, the same amber as Dominic's, narrowed at the sight of Christina. "You brought the human," she said, her tone making it clear she disapproved. "Sophia," Dominic acknowledged with a slight nod. "This is Christina Jones. She has information relevant to our situation." Sophia's gaze swept over Christina, assessing. Your call, Alpha, but the others aren't happy. She stepped aside to let them enter. Inside, the cabin was spacious and rustic, with exposed wooden beams and a massive stone fireplace. About 20 people were gathered in the main room, conversations stopping abruptly as Christina entered. She felt their collective gaze like a physical weight. This is Christina Jones, Dominic announced, his voice carrying authority that seemed to fill the room. She's here at my invitation. Her sister disappeared in our territory last year, and there's reason to believe her case is connected to our current vampire problem. Murmurs rippled through the group. Christina recognized a few faces. The bearded man from the farmer's market, the younger man from Dominic's office, and surprisingly, Helen the librarian, who gave her a small, apologetic smile. She's been marked, someone said, a tall man with dark skin and close-cropped hair. I can smell it from here. All the more reason for her to be under our protection, Marcus, Dominic replied evenly. Now, let's begin. The pack arranged themselves in what Christina realized was a hierarchy. Those closest to Dominic seemed to be his inner circle, with others positioned according to their status. She found herself standing slightly behind Dominic, aware that he had placed himself between her and the rest of the pack. For those who haven't been briefed, Dominic began, we've had 7 vampire incursions into our territory in the past month, more than the previous 2 years combined. 3 nights ago, one attacked Christina near the library. I intervened, but the vampire escaped. The one who marked her? Sophia asked. Yes, he mentioned a treaty, suggesting he's from one of the established covens, not a rogue. The bearded man, Christina now noticed his name tag read Mike, spoke up. The Northwood Coven wouldn't risk breaking the treaty. They've respected our boundaries for generations. Unless something's changed, Marcus suggested. New leadership, perhaps. Dominic nodded. Possible, but there's more. He gestured to Christina. Tell them what happened today. Christina stepped forward, acutely aware of the supernatural eyes fixed on her. She described her encounter at the diner, the man's knowledge of Melissa, and his offer to show her where her sister was last seen. He specifically used the word humans, she concluded, making it clear he wasn't one. A daywalker, Helen said, surprising Christina. Older vampires can tolerate indirect sunlight, especially on overcast days. Which means we're dealing with an established coven, Dominic agreed. Not newly turned rogues. Christina pulled out her phone, showing the map she'd photographed. My sister was researching local folklore before she disappeared. According to the innkeeper, she found something significant. Something she marked on a map near Crescent Valley. The name sent a visible ripple of tension through the room. Dominic took the phone, studying the image before passing it to Sophia. Crescent Valley has always been neutral territory, Mike said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Neither pack nor vampire claimed it, by ancient agreement. What's special about it? Christina asked. The pack members exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Dominic nodded to Helen, who stepped forward. Crescent Valley sits at a convergence of ley lines, natural energy pathways that run through the earth, the librarian explained. In supernatural terms, it's a place of power. Neither shifters nor vampires can fully control their transformations there. The energy disrupts our natural abilities. Making it the perfect neutral ground, Sophia added, and the perfect place for secret meetings between species. Christina's mind raced with the implications. You think Melissa discovered vampires and shifters meeting in Crescent Valley? Why would that happen? It wouldn't, Dominic said firmly. Not officially. Any cross-species meeting would go through me as Alpha. Unless someone in the pack was meeting with vampires without your knowledge, Christina suggested. The room went deadly silent. Several pack members stiffened, eyes flashing with anger or alarm. Dominic's expression darkened. Are you accusing one of my pack of betrayal? His voice had dropped to a dangerous rumble. Christina held her ground. I'm considering all possibilities. If Melissa found evidence of unauthorized meetings between werewolves and vampires, it would explain why both groups might want her silenced. Sophia stepped forward, eyes flashing. Watch your accusations, human. Pack loyalty is sacred. Enough. Dominic's command silenced the room instantly. Christina raises a valid concern, however unlikely. We can't dismiss any possibility. He turned to a young woman Christina hadn't noticed before, who sat quietly in a corner with a laptop. Emma, what have you found in the territory surveillance? Emma adjusted her glasses. The motion sensors along our northern border have been triggered 14 times in the past month, always at night. But the cameras show nothing. They're either malfunctioning or being deliberately disabled. And the timing corresponds with the increased vampire activity, Marcus noted. Dominic turned back to Christina. You said your sister disappeared about a year ago. Were there any specific dates in your research? Christina consulted her. Notes. She was reported missing on April 17th last year. Her last confirmed sighting was April 15th at the Riverwood Inn. Emma typed rapidly on her laptop. That's interesting. We had a similar pattern of border breaches last April, multiple triggers with no visual confirmation. I dismissed it as equipment failure at the time. So whatever's happening now also happened when Melissa disappeared, Christina said, the pieces starting to connect. And it's centered around Crescent Valley. Dominic paced the room, his movements reminiscent of the predator he could become. We need to investigate Crescent Valley directly, if vampires are using it as a base, or if there are unauthorized meetings happening there. We need to know. It's dangerous territory, Mike cautioned. Our abilities are unpredictable there. We'd be vulnerable. Which is why we'll go prepared. Dominic turned to Christina. Your sister's research. Do you have it? Some of it. She kept a cloud drive that I've accessed, but many of her files are encrypted. I've been working on breaking the passwords. Emma can help with that, Dominic said, nodding to the young woman with the laptop. She's our technology expert. Emma gave a small wave. Bring your laptop tomorrow. I'll see what I can do. Christina felt a surge of hope, the first real progress since arriving in Riverwood. Thank you. Dominic addressed the pack again. I want increased patrols along our borders, especially near Crescent Valley. No one goes alone, and everyone carries silver and wolfsbane as precautions. Silver? Christina asked, confused. I thought that harmed werewolves. It does, Helen explained, but it's also effective against vampires. We carry it as a last resort, better to be burned than killed. And wolfsbane disrupts a vampire's enhanced senses, Sophia added, makes it harder for them to track by scent. Dominic continued issuing instructions, assigning patrol schedules and communication protocols. Christina watched, impressed by the efficiency with which the pack operated under his leadership. Despite their initial resistance to her presence, they clearly respected and trusted him implicitly. As the meeting broke into smaller discussions, Dominic approached Christina. Come with me, he said quietly, leading her to a side room, a study lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. Once the door closed behind them, he seemed to relax slightly, some of the alpha persona falling away. You handled yourself well in there. Not many humans would stand their ground against a room full of shifters. I've interviewed warlords and cartel leaders, Christina said with a small shrug. Intimidation tactics look the same across species, apparently. A hint of a smile touched Dominic's lips. Perhaps. He gestured to a chair. Sit. There are things you need to understand about what you're getting into. Christina sat, watching as Dominic leaned against the desk, arms crossed. In the softer lighting of the study, his features seemed less severe, though no less striking. First, he began, you need to understand what we are. Shifters aren't the Hollywood werewolves you might imagine. We're born, not made. The ability passes genetically, though not all children of shifters inherit the trait. So you can change at will, not just during the full moon. Correct. The moon affects us, makes the wolf stronger, harder to control. But we can shift any time. With training and discipline, we maintain our human consciousness in wolf form. And silver burns you, Christina noted. What about other weaknesses? Wolfsbane can temporarily suppress our abilities. Severe trauma can prevent shifting, a broken spine, for instance. Otherwise we heal quickly and live longer than humans, though we're not immortal. Unlike vampires? Dominic's expression darkened. Vampires are different. They were human once. The transformation strips away much of their humanity, replacing it with hunger and predatory instinct. Young vampires are little more than animals, but the older ones, those who survive centuries, regain a semblance of their former selves, though twisted and cold. The one who attacked me seemed intelligent, controlled, which makes him more dangerous, not less. Dominic straightened, moving to a cabinet from which he retrieved a bottle and 2 glasses. Bourbon? Christina nodded, accepting the glass he offered. So vampires are immortal? Not exactly. They don't age, but they can be killed. Beheading, heart removal, fire. Sunlight weakens most of them, though as you discovered, the oldest can tolerate indirect daylight. He took a sip of his drink. They need blood to survive, preferably human. Animal blood sustains them, but barely. And the treaty you mentioned? Between shifters and vampires? An ancient agreement. Territories were established, hunting grounds defined. Vampires agreed to take only willing donors or to feed without killing. In return, shifter packs promised not to hunt them to extinction, which we could have done. Why make peace at all? Why not eliminate them? Dominic's amber eyes studied her over the rim of his glass. Because balance is necessary. Vampires, for all their predatory nature, serve a purpose in the supernatural ecosystem. They control other, lesser dark creatures that would otherwise proliferate, and they keep our secret from humans. A shared interest. Christina absorbed this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of the world. And Crescent Valley? What makes it special beyond the ley lines? Legend says it was the site of the original treaty signing, a place of power where neither side had advantage over the other. Dominic set down his glass. If vampires are gathering there now, breaking the ancient neutrality of the place, it signifies something serious. Something worth killing my sister over, Christina said quietly. Dominic's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry about Melissa, truly. If she stumbled onto vampire activity in Crescent Valley, especially during some kind of unauthorized meeting, she would have been seen as a threat. Christina finished her bourbon in one swallow, welcoming the burn. So what now? Now, we investigate properly. Dominic moved to a map on the wall, larger and more detailed than the one Christina had found at the library. I'll take a small team to Crescent Valley tomorrow night. We'll search for any signs of vampire activity or evidence of what your sister might have found. I'm coming with you, Christina said immediately. Dominic turned, his expression incredulous. Absolutely not. It's far too dangerous. It's my sister we're looking for information about. I know her research methods, her thinking patterns. I might notice things you'd miss. You'd be a liability in dangerous territory. You're already marked by a vampire. Your scent would draw them straight to us. Christina stood, moving to face him directly. Then use me as bait. What? Dominic's eyes flashed with anger. That's not happening. Think about it logically. They want me anyway. Why not use that to our advantage? Draw them out under controlled conditions with your pack ready. Because I won't risk your life! The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. Dominic took a step back, visibly composing himself. The pack protects humans, not endangers them. This human doesn't need your protection, Christina countered. She needs your cooperation. This is my investigation too, Dominic, my sister, my risk to take. They stood in tense silence, neither willing to back down. Finally, Dominic exhaled slowly. You're impossible, he muttered, echoing his words from their previous encounter. So you've mentioned. Another moment passed before Dominic spoke again. You can come to the edge of Crescent Valley. You'll stay with Emma and Mike at our observation point while I take Sophia and Marcus to investigate further. You will follow every instruction without question. If I tell you to leave, you leave immediately. Understood? It wasn't ideal, but it was a concession. Understood. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Christina was beginning to recognize as a sign of frustration. I must be losing my mind agreeing to this. Or gaining an ally, Christina suggested. I'm good at what I do, Dominic. Let me help. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared determination despite their differences. Dominic nodded slowly. Tomorrow night, then. I'll pick you up at sunset. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Christina. Yes? If we find evidence that your sister is truly gone. He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Then I'll have the closure I came for, Christina said quietly. And the truth, whatever it is? Dominic studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Let's hope the truth brings you peace, not more danger. As they rejoined the pack in the main room, Christina felt the weight of what lay ahead. Tomorrow night they would venture into Crescent Valley, seeking answers about Melissa's fate and the mysterious vampire activity. She was one step closer to the truth, but also deeper into a supernatural world she barely understood, with dangers beyond anything she'd faced before. And at the center of it all was Dominic Blackwood, the alpha shifter who'd reluctantly become her ally. Christina glanced at him as he OKE with his pack members, his natural authority evident in every gesture. Despite everything, she found herself trusting him, perhaps more than was wise for a human in a world of monsters. Chapter 7. The Bond morning sunlight filtered through the trees as Christina approached the Blackwood timber office. After the revelations of the previous night, she'd barely slept, her mind racing with new information about shifters, vampires, and the mysterious Crescent Valley. Tonight, they would venture to the edge of that forbidden territory, seeking answers about Melissa's disappearance. The receptionist, Sarah, Christina remembered, looked up as she entered. Miss Jones, Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. Her tone was polite but cool, her eyes lingering on the bandage still covering Christina's neck. Thank you. Christina followed Sarah's directions to a conference room at the back of the building. Inside, she found not just Dominic, but 3 other pack members. Emma with her laptop, Mike stroking his beard thoughtfully, and Sophia, whose expression made it clear she still disapproved of Christina's involvement. Dominic looked up from a map spread across the table. Christina, good timing. Hope I'm not interrupting, she said, setting her laptop and notes on the table. We were just discussing tonight's operation. Dominic gestured to the empty chair beside him. Your perspective would be valuable. Sophia made a small noise of disagreement but said nothing. Christina took the offered seat, aware of the tension her presence created. Emma has been analysing the surveillance data from our territory borders, Dominic continued. Show her what you found. The young woman turned her laptop so Christina could see the screen. I've been tracking unauthorised entries into pack territory over the past 18 months, Emma explained. There's a clear pattern. The screen showed a map of the Riverwood area with red dots marking border breaches. They clustered in 3 distinct time periods, April of last year, November, and the past month. The first cluster coincides with your sister's disappearance, Emma said, her voice gentler than Christina had expected. The second with 3 hikers who went missing in November, and now we're seeing the same pattern again. They're hunting in cycles, Christina realised. But why the gaps? Why not continuous activity? Feeding patterns, Mike suggested. Vampires don't need to feed constantly. The older ones can go months between significant feedings if necessary. Christina suppressed a shudder at the clinical discussion of vampire feeding habits. So they're coming into your territory to hunt. Why not stay in their own hunting grounds? That's what we need to determine, Dominic said. Traditional hunting grounds for the Northwood Coven are further east, away from human settlements. Coming into our territory, or even near it, violates the treaty and risks war. Unless they have a specific reason, Christina mused. The vampire who attacked me knew Melissa by name. He didn't just happen upon her, he targeted her specifically. Sophia leaned forward. The same way they're targeting you now. Exactly. Christina pulled out her notes. I've been reviewing Melissa's research. She was investigating local disappearances going back decades, focusing on patterns similar to what Emma found. She believed something was systematically taking people from this area. She was right, Mike said grimly, though she probably didn't realize what she was tracking. Christina opened her laptop. She also had this map. She turned the screen to show them a detailed topographical map of the area with various locations marked in different colors. The red markers are disappearances from the past 50 years. The blue ones are what she called energy anomalies, places where her equipment detected unusual readings. Dominic studied the map intently. The blue markers form a circle around Crescent Valley. The ley lines, Emma said, excitement in her voice. She was tracking the supernatural energy without realizing what it was. Or maybe she did realize, Christina suggested. Her last journal entries mention non-human entities and evidence of the impossible. I think she knew she'd found something supernatural. Sophia's expression had shifted from skepticism to reluctant interest. If she was tracking vampire activity and they realized it, they would have eliminated the threat, Dominic finished. But that doesn't explain why they're back now, or why they're targeting Christina specifically. Maybe I'm not the only target, Christina said slowly, a new theory forming. Emma, can you cross-reference the missing hikers from November with my sister's background? Look for any connections, profession, interests, skills. Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard. After a few minutes she looked up, surprise evident on her face. All three were journalists or researchers. One was a documentary filmmaker specializing in unexplained phenomena. Another was a freelance investigative reporter. The third was a graduate student in anthropology studying local folklore. Just like Melissa, Christina said, and me. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. They're targeting people who ask questions, Mike said finally. People who might expose them. Or people with specific knowledge, Dominic suggested, his gaze intense as he looked at Christina. What exactly was your sister researching before she came to Riverwood? Christina hesitated, then decided complete honesty was necessary. She was working on a podcast about unexplained disappearances across the Pacific Northwest. She had a theory that they were connected, that something was systematically taking people who ventured into certain wilderness areas. She was tracking vampire hunting grounds without realizing it, Sophia said, a new respect in her voice, and getting too close to the truth. Which means the vampires aren't just hunting randomly, Dominic concluded. They're eliminating threats to their secrecy, and now they're after Christina because she's continuing her sister's work. The realization sent a chill through Christina. She wasn't just a convenient target. She was being hunted specifically because of her investigation. This changes our approach for tonight, Dominic said, turning to the map on the table. If they're targeting Christina intentionally, they may be watching her movements. We need to be prepared for an ambush. I still say she shouldn't come, Sophia interjected. It's too dangerous and she'll slow us down. I'm not staying behind, Christina said firmly. Not when we're finally making progress on Melissa's case. It's not your decision, Sophia snapped. This is pack business. Enough. Dominic's voice carried the unmistakable authority of the alpha. Christina comes with us, as agreed. She stays at the observation point with Emma and Mike. The plan doesn't change. Sophia subsided, though her displeasure remained evident. Christina caught Dominic's eye, silently thanking him for his support. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that went beyond their tentative alliance. Now, Dominic continued, let's review the terrain. Crescent Valley is approximately 3 miles north of our territory border. The approach is difficult. Steep ravines, dense forest, no maintained trails. As they discussed the logistics of the night's operation, Christina observed the dynamics between the pack members. Despite Sophia's initial hostility, all three deferred to Dominic without question. His leadership style was firm but collaborative, valuing their input while maintaining clear authority. Emma, Christina learned, was not just the pack's technology expert, but also their youngest member at 24. She'd inherited the shifter gene from her father, a former pack member who had died protecting the territory from a rogue vampire 5 years earlier. Mike, with his impressive beard and quiet demeanor, served as the pack's historian and lawkeeper. His knowledge of supernatural history and shifter traditions was encyclopedic, earned through decades of study. And Sophia, despite her antagonism toward Christina, was Dominic's second-in-command, his beta, in pack terminology. Her loyalty to Dominic and the pack was absolute, which explained her suspicion of outsiders who might threaten either. As the meeting progressed into the afternoon, they ordered lunch. The casual conversation that developed revealed more about pack life than the formal briefing had. Christina listened, fascinated as they discussed everything from shifting techniques to pack celebrations. "The first shift is the hardest," Emma was explaining. "Mine happened when I was 16, later than most. I was so scared, but Dominic talked me through it." "You were brave," Dominic said, his usual intensity softening as he recalled the memory. "Youngest, successful first shift in 3 generations." Emma beamed at the praise. "Having a good alpha makes all the difference. My father always said that." "James was a fine wolf," Mike agreed solemnly. "He'd be proud of you, Emma." Christina watched Dominic during this exchange, noting how his expression changed when his pack spoke of their personal connections. Behind the authoritative alpha was a man who cared deeply for those under his protection, who saw them as family, not just subordinates. As the afternoon waned, the meeting shifted to final preparations for the night's expedition. Sophia and Mike left to gather equipment, while Emma continued analyzing data on her laptop. Christina found herself alone with Dominic near the coffee machine in the corner of the room. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for including me in this. I know Sophia thinks it's a mistake." "Sophia is protective of the pack," Dominic replied, pouring coffee for both of them. "It's her job to be cautious about outsiders." "And what do you think?" Christina accepted the cup he offered. "Is it a mistake to involve me?" Dominic considered the question, his amber eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Logically? Perhaps. You're untrained, unfamiliar with supernatural threats, and already targeted by vampires. But your sister deserves justice, and you deserve answers." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "And I find myself concerned for your safety in a way that goes beyond my usual responsibility to protect humans in our territory." The admission hung between them, laden with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Christina felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee in her hands. "Is that unusual?" she asked, her voice softer than intended. "For an alpha to feel that way about a human?" "Very." Dominic's gaze didn't waver from hers. "Shifters form strong bonds with their pack members, a connection that goes beyond human friendship or loyalty. Occasionally those bonds can extend to humans, but it's rare." "And what does it mean when it happens?" Before Dominic could answer, Emma cleared her throat from across the room. "Sorry to interrupt, but I found something interesting in Melissa's encrypted files." The moment broken, they moved back to the table where Emma had opened a document on her screen. "It's a journal entry from the day before she disappeared," Emma explained. "She wrote about following someone from town to a meeting in the forest. Listen to this. DB left the timber office at sunset driving north. I followed at a distance. He parked near the old mining road and continued on foot. I lost him in the trees but found a path leading toward the valley. Tomorrow I'll bring better equipment and follow him all the way. If my suspicions are correct, this could be the breakthrough I've been waiting for." "DB," Christina repeated, looking at Dominic. "Your initials." A tense silence fell over the room. Dominic's expression had turned to stone, his jaw tight. "That's impossible," he said finally. "I never met your sister. I certainly never led her to Crescent Valley." "Then who did she follow?" Christina asked. "Someone else with the initials DB?" "Or someone she thought was me," Dominic suggested, his mind clearly racing. someone impersonating me to lure her into a trap. Emma looked up from the laptop. There's more. The file includes a blurry photo taken at a distance. She turned the screen to show them. The image showed a tall man with dark hair walking into the forest at dusk. His face wasn't visible, but his build and the set of his shoulders were remarkably similar to Dominic's. That's not me, Dominic said firmly, but it was meant to look like me. A vampire can't shapeshift, Emma said, confusion in her voice. How could they impersonate you? They couldn't, Mike said from the doorway, having returned in time to hear the conversation. But a human working for them could dress similarly, move similarly, especially at a distance in poor light. Which means this was a deliberate setup, Christina realized. They wanted Melissa to think she was following you. They used your identity to lure her into a trap. Dominic's expression darkened with anger. And now they're trying the same tactic with you. The vampire at the diner offering to show you where Melissa was last seen. It's the same strategy. But why use your identity specifically? Christina asked. Why not just approach her directly? Because I'm the alpha, Dominic said grimly. Anyone researching local mysteries would eventually hear about the Blackwood family's influence. Using my identity creates confusion, divides loyalties, and, if the deception is discovered, creates conflict between humans and shifters. Christina felt a chill as the pieces aligned. They're not just hunting, they're deliberately sowing discord between species. Which violates the most fundamental aspect of the treaty, Dominic confirmed. This isn't just about feeding, it's about breaking the peace between vampires and shifters. The implications hung heavy in the air. What had seemed like isolated incidents, Melissa's disappearance, the missing hikers, the attack on Christina, now appeared to be part of a larger, more sinister strategy. As the others discussed the tactical implications, Christina noticed Dominic watching her, concern evident in his eyes. The connection she'd felt earlier remained, perhaps even strengthened by this new revelation. Whatever was developing between them, this unusual bond he'd mentioned, it was becoming harder for both of them to ignore. And tonight, they would venture to the edge of Crescent Valley, where Melissa had disappeared following someone she believed was Dominic Blackwood. The parallels were unsettling, but Christina was determined to see this through, to find the truth about her sister, and perhaps about the enigmatic alpha who was becoming increasingly important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Chapter 8. The trap dusk settled over Riverwood as Christina checked her equipment one last time. Flashlight, extra batteries, pepper spray, likely useless against vampires but comforting nonetheless. A small silver knife Dominic had insisted she carry, and a vial of wolfsbane extract to mask her scent if necessary. Her phone was fully charged, though Emma had warned her that reception would be spotty in the remote areas they were heading to. A soft knock at her door announced Dominic's arrival. When she opened it, she found him dressed in dark tactical clothing, black cargo pants, a charcoal Henley, and a leather jacket that allowed freedom of movement. The serious set of his jaw told her everything about his mindset. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes quickly scanning her similar attire. "As I'll ever be." Christina shouldered her small backpack. "Any changes to the plan?" "We're taking 2 vehicles now. You'll ride with me. Emma and Mike will follow in the second car. Sophia and Marcus are already scouting the perimeter of the area." The drive to the forest's edge was tense and quiet. Christina could sense Dominic's heightened alertness in the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. The revelation about Melissa being lured by someone impersonating him had clearly disturbed him deeply. "You're worried this is another trap," Christina said finally, breaking the silence. Dominic's jaw tightened. "It has all the hallmarks. The vampires know we're investigating. They know you're with us now, and they've used similar tactics before. But this time we're prepared." "Are we?" His amber eyes flicked briefly to her before returning to the road. "We're dealing with creatures who have centuries of experience in deception and hunting. They've already demonstrated they're willing to break the treaty. You don't think we should go?" It wasn't a question. What I think doesn't matter. You won't be dissuaded, and I won't let you go alone. The simple declaration carried weight beyond the words themselves. They turned onto a narrow Forest Service road, the truck's headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. After several miles, Dominic pulled over beside a nondescript trail marker. Emma and Mike's SUV stopped behind them. "We go on foot from here," Dominic said, retrieving a backpack from behind his seat. "Stay close to me at all times." The four of them gathered at the trailhead, checking communications equipment. Each wore an earpiece connected to a secure channel Emma had set up. "Sophia, status report," Dominic spoke into his mic. "Perimeter secure," came the immediate response. "No signs of vampire activity yet, but there's something off about the energy here. Marcus says he can feel it affecting his senses already." "We're 3 miles from Crescent Valley," Mike noted. "The effects shouldn't be noticeable yet." "Unless the energy patterns are changing," Emma suggested, consulting a device that resembled a modified EMF detector. "The readings are stronger than our baseline from last month." Dominic frowned. "Stay alert. The observation point is a mile in. We move quietly from here." They proceeded in formation, Dominic leading, Christina behind him, with Emma and Mike bringing up the rear. The forest grew denser as they moved away from the road, the trail barely visible in the beam of their shielded flashlights. Christina felt the change in the atmosphere gradually, a subtle pressure behind her eyes, a strange tingling along her skin. From the others' expressions, they felt it too. "The energy field is expanding," Emma whispered, checking her device. "These readings shouldn't be possible this far from the valley." "Can it affect humans?" Christina asked. "Not typically," Mike replied. "But it disrupts supernatural abilities. The closer we get to Crescent Valley, the harder it becomes for shifters to maintain control of their wolf." "And vampires?" "Similar effects. Their enhanced strength and speed become unpredictable. Some abilities fail entirely." They continued in silence for another quarter-mile before Dominic signaled a halt. Ahead, a small clearing offered a view of the valley below, though darkness obscured most details. "This is the observation point," he said quietly. "Emma, set up your equipment. Mike, secure the perimeter. Christina stays here with you, while Sophia, Marcus, and I move closer to the valley." Emma began unpacking sophisticated surveillance gear, thermal imaging cameras, directional microphones, and the strange energy detector. Mike moved methodically around the clearing, placing small objects at regular intervals. "Proximity sensors," he explained when he caught Christina watching. "They'll alert us if anything approaches within 50 yards. Dominic checked in with Sophia and Marcus, confirming their positions before turning to Christina. His expression had softened slightly from its earlier intensity. "Remember our agreement. You stay here with Emma and Mike. If anything happens, anything at all that seems wrong, you head back to the vehicles immediately." "I remember," Christina assured him. "Be careful down there." Something flickered in his eyes, concern perhaps, or something deeper. "I'll be back before you know it." As Dominic disappeared into the darkness, Christina felt a strange hollowness, as if his departure had physically affected her. She shook off the sensation, focusing instead on helping Emma set up the remaining equipment. "These cameras can detect body heat signatures at a distance of up to half a mile," Emma explained, adjusting a tripod. "Vampires run colder than humans but still register. Shifters run hotter. So we can tell them apart on the thermal imaging. Usually, the energy field can interfere with the readings, though." Emma glanced at Christina. "He's worried about you, you know. More than I've ever seen him worry about anyone outside the pack." Christina busied herself with organizing cables. "He feels responsible because of what happened to Melissa." "It's more than that." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact. "Dominic doesn't form attachments easily, especially not to humans. But there's something between you two, something the whole pack can sense." Before Christina could respond, Mike returned from his perimeter check. "All sensors active. No movement detected yet." Emma turned her attention to the monitors she'd set up. "I've got visual on Dominic and the others. They're approaching the edge of the valley now." Christina moved to look over Emma's shoulder. The thermal imaging showed 3 bright heat signatures moving carefully through the forest. Dominic's form was easily identifiable by his size and the way he moved. Purposeful, alert, powerful, even in human form. "The energy readings are spiking," Emma noted, concern in her voice. "This isn't normal, even for Crescent Valley." Mike frowned, looking at the data. "It's almost as if—" A sharp beep from the proximity sensor cut him off. All three froze, eyes darting to the monitors. "Movement at the perimeter," Emma whispered. 30 yards and closing. Temperature signature is low." "Vampire," Mike confirmed, reaching for his weapon. "Just one, coming from the east." Christina's heart hammered in her chest as she remembered the cold eyes of the vampire who had attacked her, the casual cruelty in his voice as he spoke of Melissa. "Dominic," Emma spoke urgently into her mic. "We have company. One vampire approaching the observation point." Static answered her. She tried again, alarm growing in her voice. "Dominic? Sophia? Do you copy?" "The energy field must be interfering with communications," Mike said grimly. "We're on our own." He positioned himself between the approaching threat and the women, a silver blade appearing in his hand. "Emma, get Christina back to the vehicles. I'll hold it off." "We can't leave you alone," Emma protested. "That's an order. Go." The proximity sensor beeped again, faster now. Whatever was approaching had accelerated. "Too late," Emma whispered, drawing her own weapon. "It's coming too fast." Christina gripped the silver knife Dominic had given her, knowing it would be little protection against a vampire's supernatural speed and strength. Still, she wouldn't go down without a fight. The attack, when it came, was not from the direction they expected. A figure dropped silently from the trees above, landing directly in the center of their small camp. Before any of them could react, the vampire, a woman with pale blonde hair and predatory grace, had Emma by the throat. "Don't move," she hissed at Mike, who had started forward. "I can snap her neck before your blade touches me." Mike froze, fury and fear warring in his expression. The vampire's cold eyes shifted to Christina, a smile curving her bloodless lips. "Christina Jones, you've been making quite a nuisance of yourself." Her accent was faintly European, her voice melodic despite the menace in her words. "Just like your sister." "Let Emma go," Christina demanded, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel," the vampire said, "is with those who disturb the natural order. Humans who ask too many questions, shifters who forget their place." She tightened her grip on Emma, who gasped for breath. "But you're right about one thing. You're the one I came for." "Then take me and let her go," Christina said, taking a step forward. "Christina, don't," Mike warned. The vampire laughed, a chilling sound in the darkness. "How noble, but unnecessary." With a casual flick of her wrist, she threw Emma into Mike, sending both crashing into the equipment. "I'll deal with the wolves later." Before Christina could react, the vampire was before her, moving with impossible speed. Cold fingers gripped her chin, forcing her to meet those inhuman eyes. "Your sister had the same determined look," the vampire mused, "right until the end." Rage surged through Christina. She drove her silver knife toward the vampire's heart, putting all her strength behind the blow. The vampire caught her wrist easily, but not before the blade sliced across her forearm. The wound sizzled, drawing a hiss of pain from the creature. "Spirited too," the vampire snarled, twisting Christina's arm until the knife fell from her grasp. "That will make this so much more entertaining." From the corner of her eye, Christina saw Mike struggling to his feet, Emma unconscious beside him. The vampire followed her gaze and smiled. "Your friends can't help you, and your alpha is otherwise occupied." She leaned closer, her breath cold against Christina's ear. "He's walking into a trap just as you have. By the time he realizes it, you'll be long gone." Horror washed through Christina as she understood. "This was all a setup. You wanted to separate us." "Very good." The vampire's grip tightened painfully. "Elias will be pleased with your cleverness. He's been so looking forward to meeting you, ever since he tasted your blood." The vampire who had attacked her at the library. Christina struggled against the iron grip, but it was useless. The creature's strength was overwhelming. "Dominic will find me," she said with more confidence than she felt. "He'll track me." "Oh, we're counting on it." The vampire's smile widened. "But by then it will be too late for you, just as it was for Melissa." A sharp pain exploded at the base of Christina's skull, and darkness rushed in from all sides. Her last conscious thought was of Dominic, walking into danger because of her. Consciousness returned slowly, painfully. Christina's head throbbed where she'd been struck, and her mouth felt dry as cotton. She kept her eyes closed, assessing her situation before alerting her captors that she was awake. She was seated in a chair, her wrists bound behind her with what felt like zip ties. The air was cool and damp, with an earthy smell that suggested she was underground. Distant water dripped somewhere, the sound echoing slightly. A cave or tunnel system, perhaps. Voices murmured nearby, at least 3 different speakers. 1 female, likely the vampire who had captured her, and 2 males. Their tones were hushed but intense, as if arguing. "Should have waited," one male voice was saying. "The Alpha was the primary target." "The human was the bait," the female responded. "Now he'll come to us, exactly as planned." "Unless the energy field prevents him from tracking her," the second male voice countered. This one was familiar. The vampire from the library, Elias. "The disruption is spreading faster than anticipated." "He'll find a way," the female said confidently. "His connection to her is stronger than we expected. Elias felt it when he tasted her blood." "A complication we didn't foresee," the first male said. "If the Alpha has begun bonding with a human—" "It makes no difference to the outcome," the female cut him off. "The treaty ends tonight, one way or another." Christina's mind raced. They had captured her specifically to lure Dominic into a trap. The connection they mentioned. Was it the same bond Dominic had alluded to earlier? And what did they mean about ending the treaty? She risked opening her eyes slightly, peering through her lashes. She was in a large cavern, illuminated by battery-powered lanterns placed around the perimeter. Her chair sat against one wall, while the 3 vampires stood in a loose circle about 20 feet away. Beyond them she could see tunnel entrances leading in several directions. The female was the blonde who had captured her. Beside her stood a tall, aristocratic man with silver-streaked dark hair, the one whose voice she didn't recognize. And the third was unmistakably Elias, the vampire who had attacked her at the library. His eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to glow with a reddish tint. "She's awake," Elias said suddenly, turning toward Christina. "Her heartbeat has changed." Christina abandoned the pretense, opening her eyes fully to glare at her captors. "Where am I?" The silver-haired vampire approached, studying her with cold curiosity. "The human who caused so much trouble. You look remarkably like your sister." "Where is Melissa?" Christina demanded. "What did you do to her?" "Melissa proved quite useful," he replied, circling her chair slowly. "As will you in time." "Victor," the female vampire cautioned, "we need her intact for now." Victor, apparently the leader, smiled thinly. "Of course, Katerina. I'm merely getting acquainted with our guest." He stopped in front of Christina. "Your sister was investigating disappearances in the area. She was getting close to discovering our existence. Normally we would have simply eliminated her, but she had certain qualities that made her valuable." "What qualities?" Christina's mouth went dry with dread. "Determination, intelligence, a rare blood type." Victor's eyes gleamed. "And a connection to someone who would eventually come looking for her." "You kept her alive." Hope and horror mingled in Christina's chest. "For a time." Victor's casual tone made the words even more chilling. "She was quite resistant at first, but humans can be persuaded to cooperate, given the right incentives." "You monster," Christina whispered, rage building inside her. "Where is she now?" "Gone, I'm afraid." Victor didn't even attempt to sound regretful. "She served her purpose, providing information about her family, her background, details that would be useful when her sister inevitably came searching." Christina fought against her restraints, grief and fury overwhelming caution. "I'll kill you." I swear I'll find a way. Victor laughed, the sound echoing in the cavern. Your spirit is admirable but misplaced. You should be honored. Your sister's sacrifice, and soon yours, will reshape the balance of power in this region for centuries to come. The treaty, Christina said, remembering their earlier conversation. You're deliberately breaking it. Why? The treaty has outlived its usefulness, Katerina said, joining Victor. Shifters have grown complacent, weak. They protect humans who would destroy us all if they knew of our existence. The time has come for a new order, Victor added, one where vampires reclaim their rightful place as apex predators. And my sister's disappearance was part of this plan, Christina asked, trying to keep them talking while she worked at her restraints. Luring me here too. A test initially, Victor explained. We needed to understand the pack's response to a human disappearance in their territory. Your sister provided that opportunity. When they did little more than a cursory investigation, we knew they had grown soft. But then you arrived, Elias spoke up, his eyes fixed hungrily on Christina's neck where his bite marks were still healing. And suddenly the Alpha was personally involved, breaking pack protocols, sharing secrets with a human. You created a perfect weakness for us to exploit, Victor concluded. Dominic Blackwood will come for you, leaving his pack vulnerable. When he enters Crescent Valley, the energy field will suppress his abilities, making him easy prey. And with the Alpha dead, the pack will fracture, Katerina added with cruel satisfaction, leaving Riverwood defenseless against us. Christina's blood ran cold as she understood the full scope of their plan. This wasn't just about her or Melissa. It was about destroying the pack and taking over the territory. And Dominic was walking into their trap because of her. He won't come alone, she said, trying to sound confident. The entire pack will be with him. We're counting on it, Victor smiled. Divided, distracted, in territory that weakens them, they'll fall one by one. A distant howl echoed through the cavern, a sound of rage and challenge that Christina instantly recognized as Dominic's wolf form. The vampires exchanged satisfied glances. Right on schedule, Victor said. Katerina, prepare the others. Elias, stay with our guest. If the Alpha makes it this far, I want him to find her alive. Barely. As Victor and Katerina departed down one of the tunnels, Elias moved closer to Christina, his eyes fixed on her throat. We have some time before the fun begins, he said, running a cold finger along her jawline. Perhaps we should get better acquainted. Christina jerked away from his touch. He'll kill you, you know, when Dominic finds me. If he finds you, Elias corrected. Crescent Valley's energy is unpredictable. It affects vampires, yes, but shifters even more so. The closer he gets to the center, the more his control will slip. By the time he reaches these caves, he'll be more wolf than man, savage, unthinking. Another howl sounded, closer now, but with a strange, pained quality that made Christina's heart clench. Dominic was coming for her, fighting through the energy field's effects to reach her. You underestimate him, she said, meeting Elias's gaze defiantly. And you underestimate what he'll do to protect what's his. Elias laughed, but there was uncertainty beneath the sound. His? Has the Alpha claimed you human? How fascinating. He leaned closer, inhaling near her neck. I still smell my mark on you. You belong to me by right of first blood. I belong to no one, Christina spat. Least of all a parasite like you. Anger flashed in Elias's eyes. Your sister said similar things, before she learned her place. The mention of Melissa renewed Christina's determination. She had to stay alive, had to find a way to warn Dominic about the trap. The zip ties cut into her wrists as she worked them against the chair's rough edge, feeling them gradually weaken. What did Victor mean about Melissa being useful? She asked, trying to distract Elias. What did you make her do? Information primarily, Elias said, pacing before her. She knew so much about the town, about the Blackwood family's history, and she had such interesting theories about the supernatural. He smiled cruelly. We helped her confirm those theories, of course. You tortured her, Christina said flatly. We educated her. Elias shrugged. Humans are so fragile, though. She didn't last as long as we'd hoped. Christina swallowed the bile rising in her throat. And now you plan to do the same to me? Oh no. Elias's smile widened. You have a much more important role to play. The Alpha's weakness. His downfall. He cocked his head, listening. Speaking of which, I believe our guest of honor is getting closer. The howls had indeed grown nearer, accompanied now by sounds of conflict, snarls, crashes, cries of pain. The battle had begun somewhere in the tunnel system. Your pack is dying out there, Elias taunted. All because you couldn't leave well enough alone, just like your sister. Christina felt the zip tie give way slightly, just a little more pressure and she might break free. She needed to keep him talking, keep him distracted. If Dominic is so weakened by the energy field, why are you hiding in here? She challenged. Afraid to face him directly? Elias's expression darkened. I fear nothing, least of all a half-transformed shifter. Prove it, Christina goaded. Go help your friends instead of guarding a helpless human. For a moment she thought she'd pushed too far. Elias moved toward her with supernatural speed, his hand closing around her throat. Perhaps I should silence you permanently, he hissed. Victor only said to keep you alive, not unharmed. Christina struggled for breath, spots dancing before her eyes. The zip tie was almost broken. One more good pull might do it, but she needed both hands free to have any chance against a vampire. A tremendous crash echoed from the nearest tunnel, followed by a roar that was neither fully human nor fully wolf. Elias's grip loosened slightly as he turned toward the sound. Impossible, he muttered. He shouldn't be able to get this far while maintaining any control. Christina seized the moment, throwing all her strength into breaking the zip tie. It snapped with a small pop, freeing her hands. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the silver crucifix she'd kept hidden in her sleeve, a precaution Mike had insisted on, and pressed it against Elias's hand on her throat. The vampire recoiled with a shriek of pain, the silver burning his flesh. Christina lunged from the chair, putting distance between them as she searched desperately for a weapon. Elias recovered quickly, fury contorting his features. You'll pay for that, human. He moved to attack, but froze at a sound from the tunnel entrance, a low, rumbling growl that raised the hair on Christina's neck. Both turned to see a massive shape emerging from the darkness. It wasn't the wolf form Christina had glimpsed before. This was something between man and beast, Dominic caught in mid-transformation. He stood upright but hunched, his body larger and more muscular than his human form. Fur covered portions of his skin, his face elongated into a partial muzzle, claws extending from his fingers. But his eyes, those were unchanged, burning amber with recognition when they found Christina. Alpha! Elias hissed, backing away. You shouldn't be able to maintain that form here. Dominic's response was a snarl that showed elongated fangs. He moved into the cavern with predatory grace, positioning himself between Christina and the vampire. She's mine, he growled, his voice deeper and rougher than human. Mine to protect. The claim sent a shiver through Christina that had nothing to do with fear. Even in this half-transformed state, Dominic was protecting her, had fought his way through the energy field, and who knew how many vampires to reach her. Elias looked frantically toward the other tunnels, but no help was forthcoming. Whatever battle was raging elsewhere in the cave system, he was on his own. The treaty is broken, Elias said, trying to sound defiant despite his obvious fear. Victor has declared war on the shifters. This is only the beginning. No, Dominic growled. For you, it's the end. He launched himself at the vampire with shocking speed. Elias was fast, but Dominic's rage and determination made him faster. They collided in a blur of movement, the sound of their combat echoing off the cavern walls. Christina pressed herself against the wall, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes fell on a lantern nearby. Fire! Vampires were vulnerable to fire. She grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the stone floor. The fuel spilled out, flames erupting instantly. Christina seized a burning piece of the lantern's frame, holding it like a torch. Dominic and Elias were locked in brutal combat, each landing devastating blows. The vampire's supernatural strength was partially matched by Dominic's hybrid form, but Elias had the advantage of not being affected as severely by the energy field. As Dominic was thrown against a wall, momentarily stunned, Elias turned toward Christina with murderous intent. She stood her ground, the makeshift torch held before her. "Stay back," she warned. Elias laughed. "A little fire won't save you, human." "No," came Dominic's voice from behind him. "But I will." Before Elias could turn, Dominic's clawed hand plunged into his back, emerging through his chest. The vampire gasped, looking down in shock at the hand protruding from his ribcage. "This is for Christina," Dominic growled, "and for her sister." With a savage twist, he tore out the vampire's heart. Elias collapsed, his body already beginning to desiccate. Christina rushed forward with her torch, setting the remains ablaze. They watched in grim silence as the vampire's body was consumed by flames. When it was done, Dominic turned to Christina, his hybrid form still maintained through sheer willpower. Blood, both his and the vampire's, covered his fur-patched skin. Wounds were visible across his torso, though they seemed to be healing even as she watched. "Christina," he said, her name a rumble in his transformed throat. "Are you hurt?" "No," she managed, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "But Melissa, they confirmed she's dead. They used her to get information, to set this all up." Grief and rage warred in Dominic's eyes. "I'm sorry, so sorry." He took a step toward her, then stopped, seeming uncertain of his welcome in this monstrous form. Christina closed the distance between them without hesitation, placing her hand against his partially transformed face. "You came for me," she whispered. "Through all of this, you found me." "I would always find you," he said, the words carrying a weight of meaning beyond their immediate situation. "The bond between us, I can feel it, even through the energy field." Christina felt it too, a connection that defied explanation, that had drawn him to her against all odds. Before she could respond, a howl echoed from one of the tunnels, a call for help. "The pack," Dominic said, tensing. "The battle's not over. Victor and Katerina are still out there." "Then we finish this," Christina said, retrieving Elias's dropped silver blade. "Together." Dominic looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes, then nodded. "Stay close to me. The worst is yet to come." As they moved toward the tunnel where the fighting continued, Christina knew they were heading into even greater danger. But for the first time since learning of Melissa's disappearance, she felt a grim sense of purpose. Her sister was gone, but her killers would face justice. And somehow, against all logic, she had found an unexpected ally, perhaps something more, in the alpha werewolf who had risked everything to save her. The vampire leader awaited them, and with him, the final answers about Melissa's fate. Christina gripped the silver blade tighter, ready to face whatever came next, not just for closure but for vengeance. Chapter 9. The Battle. The tunnels stretched before them, dark and foreboding. Sounds of combat echoed from deeper within, snarls, crashes and cries that spoke of a desperate struggle. Christina gripped the silver blade tightly, her heart pounding as she followed Dominic's half-transformed figure through the darkness. "Stay behind me," Dominic growled, his voice still rough from the partial shift. "If I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." "I'm not leaving you or the pack," Christina replied firmly, "not when we're so close to ending this." Dominic glanced back at her, something like pride mingling with concern in his amber eyes. "Stubborn human." "So you've mentioned." They moved cautiously forward, the tunnel gradually widening as they approached another cavern. The sounds of fighting grew louder, punctuated by flashes of light visible around the bend ahead. Christina could make out voices now, Sophia's commanding shouts, Mike's deeper tones, and the cold, aristocratic cadence that belonged to Victor. Dominic paused at the tunnel's end, assessing the situation before they entered. Christina peered around him, taking in the scene with a journalist's eye for detail. The cavern was larger than the one where she'd been held, its ceiling lost in darkness above. Battery-powered lanterns cast harsh shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the chaos within. The pack members, At least 6 of them that Christina could see were engaged in combat with nearly a dozen vampires. Some of the shifters were in wolf form, others in the same hybrid state as Dominic, and a few remained human, wielding silver weapons with practiced skill. Sophia fought near the center, her wolf form a blur of motion as she battled Katerina. The female vampire moved with lethal grace, dodging Sophia's attacks while landing blows of her own. Blood matted Sophia's fur, but she showed no signs of yielding. Mike and Marcus stood back to back, fending off 3 vampires with silver-edged weapons. Emma was nowhere to be seen, and Christina felt a stab of worry for the young shifter. And there, commanding the scene from a raised stone platform at the far end, stood Victor. The vampire leader observed the battle with cold detachment, occasionally issuing orders but not directly engaging in the fight. Beside him stood a dark-haired female vampire Christina hadn't seen before, her posture suggesting she was his personal guard. "The pack is holding their own, but they're outnumbered," Dominic murmured. "And the energy field is affecting their abilities to shift fully." "What's the plan?" Christina asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the horror unfolding before them. "I need to reach Victor. He's the key. Take him down and the others will scatter." Dominic's claws extended further as he spoke, his body tensing for combat. "I'll create a path through the center. You stay in the shadows, work your way around the perimeter toward Mike and Marcus. They'll protect you." Christina nodded, though she had no intention of simply seeking protection. The silver blade in her hand felt inadequate against such supernatural threats, but it was better than nothing. And she had something the vampires didn't expect, a human's immunity to the energy field that hampered both species' abilities. "Ready?" Dominic asked, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that conveyed everything words couldn't in that moment. "Ready," she confirmed. With a roar that shook dust from the cavern ceiling, Dominic burst into the battle. The effect was immediate. All eyes turned toward the Alpha, his presence commanding attention even in the chaos. Several vampires fell back, momentarily stunned by his appearance. Christina used the distraction to slip along the cavern wall, staying in the shadows as instructed. She moved carefully, watching for threats while keeping track of Dominic's progress through the melee. He cut through the battle like a force of nature, his hybrid form allowing him to combine the wolf's strength with human tactical thinking. 2 vampires fell in his initial charge, their bodies crumpling as his claws found vital points. A third managed to land a blow that would have incapacitated a human, but Dominic barely slowed, throwing the attacker into a stone column with bone-crushing force. "The Alpha lives!" Sophia howled, her voice carrying renewed hope. "To the Alpha!" The pack rallied at her cry, fighting with renewed vigor. Christina continued her circuitous route, nearly reaching Mike and Marcus when a cold hand clamped around her ankle. She looked down to see a wounded vampire on the ground, his eyes burning with hunger as he pulled her toward him. Without hesitation, Christina drove her silver blade into his shoulder. The vampire shrieked, releasing her as the silver burned his flesh. She twisted the knife, remembering Dominic's instructions on how to incapacitate a vampire without killing it outright. "Where's Emma?" she demanded, pressing the blade deeper. "The young shifter. What happened to her?" the vampire hissed in pain. "Side tunnel. They took her. Feeding." Horror and rage surged through Christina. She withdrew the blade and before the vampire could recover, plunged it into his heart. His body began to desiccate immediately, turning to a husk before her eyes. She looked toward the battle, torn between continuing toward Mike as planned or searching for Emma. The young shifter had helped her decrypt Melissa's files, had shown her kindness when others were suspicious. Christina couldn't leave her to die at the hands of feeding vampires. Decision made, she scanned the cavern walls, quickly spotting a smaller tunnel entrance where 2 vampires stood guard. That had to be where they'd taken Emma. But how to get past the guards? Christina's gaze fell on a fallen lantern near the vampire she'd just dispatched. Fire, still their greatest weakness. She grabbed the lantern, relieved to find it intact and still burning. Then she searched the dead vampire's clothing, finding what she hoped for, a small flask. She unscrewed the cap, catching the sharp scent of alcohol. "Thank you, vampire drinking habits," she muttered, dousing a piece of torn cloth from her jacket in the liquor. She wrapped it around the blade of her knife, creating a makeshift torch that ignited when touched to the lantern's flame. The flaming knife wouldn't last long, but it didn't need to. Christina took a deep breath, then stepped out of the shadows, moving purposefully toward the guarded tunnel as if she belonged there. The vampires were focused on the main battle, where Dominic was now engaged with 3 opponents simultaneously, his roars echoing through the cavern. She made it within 15 feet of the guards before one noticed her. His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with recognition. "The human!" he snarled, alerting his companion. "She's escaped!" Christina didn't wait for them to attack. She hurled the flaming knife directly at the first guard, her aim true. The blade embedded itself in his chest, the alcohol-soaked cloth igniting his clothing. As he screamed, flailing in panic, Christina charged the second guard with the lantern held before her like a shield. The vampire recoiled from the flames, giving Christina the opening she needed. She swung the lantern in a wide arc, forcing him further back, then smashed it at his feet. Fire erupted across the stone floor, cutting him off from her as she darted into the tunnel. The passage was narrow and dark, but she could hear sounds ahead, a pained whimper that had to be Emma, and the murmur of voices. Christina moved as quietly as possible, wishing she had another weapon. The silver blade was lost, embedded in the burning vampire outside. The tunnel opened into a small chamber where a horrific scene awaited. Emma lay on a stone altar, her body limp and pale. 2 vampires hunched over her, one at her neck, the other at her wrist, both drinking deeply. They were so engrossed in their feeding that they hadn't yet noticed Christina's arrival. Cold fury replaced fear in Christina's heart. Without a weapon, she had only one advantage: surprise. She scanned the chamber quickly, noting a collection of implements on a nearby table. Among them gleamed a silver ceremonial dagger. Moving silently, Christina reached for the dagger. Her fingers had just closed around the hilt when one of the feeding vampires lifted his head, blood staining his lips as he sensed her presence. "More fresh meat," he hissed, pleasure evident in his voice. "Victor is generous today." "Victor is dead," Christina lied boldly, brandishing the dagger. "Dominic tore out his heart. Your coven is finished." Uncertainty flickered across the vampire's features. The second one, a female with matted dark hair, looked up from Emma's wrist. "She lies," the female said, though doubt tinged her voice. "We would have felt our master's passing." "Would you?" Christina challenged, taking a step forward. "In this place, where the energy field disrupts your connection, are you sure?" The vampires exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. Christina used their hesitation to move closer to Emma, whose chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. She was alive, but barely. "Step away from her," Christina commanded, summoning all the authority she could muster. "Or join your master in death." The male vampire snarled, hunger overriding caution as he lunged toward Christina. She was ready, heavy. Ing anticipated his attack. The silver dagger slashed across his face, drawing a howl of pain as the blessed metal burned his flesh. He stumbled back, hands covering his ruined features. The female was more cautious, circling to Christina's left, looking for an opening. "You can't save her," she taunted. "We've taken too much. The little wolf will die and you'll join her." "I don't think so," Christina replied, keeping the dagger between them. "Your friend is about to have company." The female frowned in confusion, then screamed as massive jaws closed around her shoulder from behind. Marcus, in his hybrid form similar to Dominic's, had followed Christina's trail. With a savage twist, he tore the vampire away from Emma, throwing her against the wall with bone-crushing force. The male vampire tried to flee, but Marcus was on him in an instant, claws ripping through undead flesh with terrible efficiency. Christina rushed to Emma's side, checking her pulse. It was thready and weak, but present. "Emma?" she called, gently patting the young shifter's cheek. "Emma, stay with me. We're getting you out of here." Emma's eyelids fluttered. "Christina," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How?" "Save your strength," Christina urged, tearing strips from her own shirt to bind Emma's bleeding wounds. "Marcus is here. We're taking you home." Marcus approached, his hybrid form splattered with vampire blood. The two feeders lay in pieces behind him, their remains already beginning to decay. "Can you carry her?" Christina asked. Marcus nodded, carefully lifting Emma's limp form. His eyes conveyed what his transformed mouth couldn't easily articulate: gratitude for Christina's intervention. "The main battle," Christina said as they moved back toward the tunnel. "What's happening?" Marcus growled, nodding toward the sounds of continued fighting. The message was clear. It wasn't over yet. They emerged from the side tunnel to find the larger cavern still in chaos, though the tide had shifted. Several vampire bodies lay scattered across the stone floor, while the pack had formed a defensive circle near the center. Dominic was no longer visible from their position, but Sophia's wolf form fought fiercely alongside Mike, both bloodied but unbowed. "Get Emma to safety," Christina told Marcus. "I need to find Dominic." Marcus hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her unprotected. "I'll be careful," she promised. "Emma needs immediate help. Go!" With a final concerned look, Marcus carried Emma toward a different tunnel that presumably led to an exit. Christina turned her attention back to the battle, searching for Dominic among the combatants. She spotted him at last, near the raised platform where Victor had been standing. The vampire leader was no longer observing from a distance. He and Dominic were locked in brutal combat, each landing devastating blows that would have killed a human instantly. Even from across the cavern, Christina could see that Dominic was struggling. The energy field's effects seemed to be intensifying, causing his hybrid form to flicker, parts of him shifting between human and wolf unpredictably. Victor, though affected, maintained better control, his centuries of existence apparently granting him greater resistance. Christina needed to help, but how? She clutched the silver dagger, knowing it would be of little use against a vampire as powerful as Victor. Her gaze swept the cavern, searching for anything that might turn the tide. Her attention caught on a series of stalactites hanging from the ceiling directly above the platform where Dominic and Victor fought. The stone formations were massive, their points like natural spears poised above the combatants, and near her position, partially hidden behind a column, was what appeared to be old mining equipment, including a box that might contain explosives. It was a desperate plan, but Christina had no better options. She made her way to the equipment, staying low and using the ongoing battle as cover. The box was locked, but the ancient wood gave way easily to a nearby rock. Inside she found exactly what she'd hoped for: several sticks of dynamite, old but likely still functional, and primitive blasting caps. Christina had no experience with explosives, but she'd researched mining operations for an article once. The basics couldn't be that different from what she'd learned. She assembled a crude charge, using the silver dagger to carefully connect the components. Now she needed to get close enough to the ceiling above Victor to place the explosive. Her gaze travelled upward, noting a narrow ledge that ran along the cavern wall, leading to a position above the platform. Taking a deep breath, Christina began her ascent, using natural handholds in the rough stone. The fighting below provided perfect cover. No one looked up as she made her precarious way along the ledge, the makeshift bomb clutched carefully in one hand. Below, Dominic roared in pain as Victor landed a devastating blow, sending the Alpha staggering back. Blood poured from multiple wounds across Dominic's body, his healing ability clearly compromised by the energy field. "You fought well, Shifter," Victor's cold voice carried to Christina's position. "But this was inevitable. Your kind has grown soft, protecting humans instead of ruling them. The natural order must be restored." "There's nothing natural about what you've done," Dominic growled, struggling to maintain his hybrid form. "Breaking the treaty, murdering innocents, torturing Melissa Jones." "The human was merely a means to an end," Victor replied dismissively. "As her sister will be. Once you're dead, Christina Jones will serve the same purpose: information, then sustenance." Christina reached the position above the platform, directly over the stalactites that hung precariously from the ceiling. She wedged herself into a small alcove, setting up the explosive against the weakest point in the rock. "You'll never touch her," Dominic snarled, lunging at Victor despite his injuries. The vampire sidestepped with supernatural grace, landing another punishing blow. "I already have her scent, Alpha. When this is over, I'll track her to the ends of the earth. She'll join her sister in serving my coven." Christina struck a match, her hand steady despite the height and danger. The fuse caught, beginning its short burn toward detonation. She had seconds to get clear. "Christina is not her sister," Dominic said, his voice carrying a certainty that made Christina pause in her retreat. "She's stronger, smarter, more determined than you can imagine. And she's already beaten you." Victor laughed coldly. "What delusion is this? The human is probably dead already, caught by my feeders as she tried to escape." "Look up," Dominic said simply. Victor's gaze snapped upward, finding Christina just as she scrambled away from the burning fuse. The vampire's eyes widened in shock and rage. "Impossible!" he hissed. The explosion rocked the cavern, deafening in the enclosed space. Rock shattered, the stalactites breaking free from the ceiling in a deadly rain of stone. Christina clung to the ledge as debris showered down, covering her head as best she could. When she dared to look, the platform below had been obliterated. Massive stone spears had impaled the area where Victor had been standing. Dust filled the air, obscuring her view of Dominic. "Dominic!" she screamed, fear clutching at her heart. Had she caught him in the collapse as well? The fighting had stopped, vampires and shifters alike stunned by the sudden destruction. As the dust began to settle, Christina made out a figure moving amid the rubble, Dominic, bloodied but alive, pulling himself from the debris. But Victor was nowhere to be seen. Had the vampire been crushed, impaled, or had he somehow escaped? Christina's question was answered as cold hands seized her from behind, yanking her from her precarious position on the ledge. She found herself dangling over the 30-foot drop, Victor's grip on her throat the only thing preventing her fall. "Clever human," he snarled, his perfect composure shattered, face contorted with rage. "Too clever for your own good." Below, Dominic looked up in horror. "Christina! Your human dies now, Alpha," Victor called down. "Watch as I take what you failed to protect." Christina struggled in his grip, the silver dagger still clutched in her hand. With all her strength she drove it backward, feeling it sink into Victor's thigh. The vampire howled in pain but didn't release her. "You'll suffer for that," he hissed in her ear. "I'll drain you slowly, over days." "Like you did to Melissa?" Christina gasped, fighting for breath against his crushing grip. "Tell me what you did to her. I deserve to know." Victor laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "Your sister fought too at first, so determined to expose the truth. But humans break, Christina. They all break eventually." "What did you do?" Christina demanded, twisting the dagger deeper. "We kept her alive for months," Victor said, his voice a cold whisper against her ear. "Feeding, questioning, experimenting. She told us everything, about you, about her research, about the human authorities who might come looking. And when she had nothing left to give, I drained her myself. Her blood was exceptional, as I expect yours will be." Grief and rage exploded within Christina. With a scream of fury, she wrenched the dagger free and slashed backward, catching Victor across the face. The silver burned his flesh, drawing another howl of pain. His grip loosened just enough for Christina to twist free, but without his support, she plummeted toward the stone floor below. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion. Christina saw Dominic racing toward her, knew he wouldn't reach her in time. She closed her eyes, bracing for impact. Instead of stone, she crashed into something solid but yielding, Sophia's wolf form, positioned perfectly to break her fall. They tumbled together, the shifter absorbing most of the impact. Christina rolled free, bruised and winded but alive. "Thank you," she gasped to Sophia, who gave a quick nod before returning her attention to the threat above. Victor had recovered, his face a ruined mask where the silver had burned him. He leapt down from the ledge with inhuman grace, landing between Christina and Dominic. "Enough games," the vampire snarled. "You die now, Alpha. Then you're pack. Then you're human. You're outnumbered, Victor, Dominic said, gesturing around the cavern where the remaining vampires had either fled or been killed. The pack members had formed a circle, closing in on the vampire leader. It's over. It's never over, Victor replied, his composure returning despite his injuries. I've lived for centuries, Shifter. I'll live centuries more, long after your bones are dust. Not this time, came a new voice from the tunnel entrance. Christina turned to see Helen the librarian standing there, holding what appeared to be an ancient wooden box. The older woman's eyes were hard as she approached, the pack parting to let her through. The Holloway relic, Victor breathed, recognition and fear mingling in his voice. Where did you get that? My family has guarded it for generations, Helen replied calmly, waiting for the day it would be needed again. She opened the box, revealing a small, unimpressive-looking stone tablet covered in symbols Christina didn't recognize. Yet the effect on Victor was immediate. He recoiled, hissing in pain as if the mere sight of the object burned him. The original treaty, Dominic explained for Christina's benefit, his voice regaining strength. Signed in blood by the first vampires and shifters to settle this territory. It binds all who dwell here to its terms. Which you have broken, Victor, Helen continued, advancing with the tablet held before her. By your actions you have forfeited the protection it offered your kind. Stay back, witch, Victor snarled, but there was fear beneath his anger now. I am no witch, Helen replied, just a keeper of old knowledge, and this tablet calls for justice. The symbols on the stone began to glow with an eerie blue light, pulsing in rhythm like a heartbeat. Victor screamed, falling to his knees as the light seemed to reach out toward him, wrapping around his form in ethereal tendrils. What's happening? Christina whispered to Dominic, who had moved to her side. The treaty magic, he explained quietly. It's binding him, preventing him from using his powers to escape judgment. Victor writhed on the ground, his supernatural strength useless against the ancient magic. This changes nothing, he spat. My coven will avenge me. The war has already begun. Your coven is scattered or dead, Sophia said, having shifted back to human form. She stood naked and bloodied but unbowed. And any who return will meet the same fate. Dominic stepped forward, his hybrid form stabilizing as the tablet's magic seemed to counteract the energy field's disruption. He stood over Victor, claws extended. This is for the treaty you broke, he said, voice rumbling with barely contained rage. For the pack members you killed, for the humans you murdered. His eyes found Christina's, and for Melissa Jones, who deserved better than to die at the hands of a monster. Victor struggled against the magical bonds, his face contorted with hatred. Do it then, Alpha. Prove you're the animal I always knew you were. Dominic looked to Christina, a question in his eyes. This was her sister's killer. The judgment was, in part, hers to make. Christina stepped forward, meeting Victor's hateful gaze without flinching. You took Melissa from me. You tortured her, used her, and discarded her when she had nothing left to give. Her voice was steady despite the grief and rage churning within her. But killing you won't bring her back. She turned to Dominic. Justice, not vengeance. Isn't that what separates us from them? Something like pride flickered in Dominic's eyes. He nodded, then addressed the pack. Victor, leader of the Northwood Coven, has broken the ancient treaty and shed innocent blood on our territory. By the old laws, his fate is sealed. He looked to Helen, who stepped forward with the tablet. The treaty demands balance, she said solemnly. A life for a life would be simplest. But there is another way. Binding, imprisonment, eternal vigilance. No, Victor snarled. I would rather die than be caged. That is not your choice to make, Dominic replied coldly. Helen, prepare the binding ritual. Victor will face eternal imprisonment for his crimes. As Helen began chanting in an ancient language, the tablet's glow intensifying, Victor made one last, desperate lunge toward Christina. Despite the magical restraints, his hatred gave him enough strength to reach for her throat. Dominic moved with blinding speed, intercepting the vampire's attack. In one fluid motion, his claws slashed across Victor's neck, nearly severing his head. "So be it," Dominic growled as the vampire collapsed. "Death it is." He finished the job with a clean strike, separating Victor's head from his body. The vampire's remains began to desiccate immediately, turning to dust before their eyes. A profound silence fell over the cavern. The battle was over. Victor was dead. The treaty had been upheld, though at terrible cost. Christina stood motionless, watching the last of her sister's murderer crumble to dust. She felt hollow, the vengeance she'd sought providing no comfort against the finality of Melissa's death. Tears she'd held back for too long finally spilled down her cheeks. Dominic approached her slowly, his hybrid form gradually shifting back toward human as the immediate danger passed. Without words, he opened his arms, offering comfort without demanding she accept it. Christina stepped into his embrace, her body shaking with silent sobs. His arms closed around her, strong and secure, as the pack looked on in solemn witness to their alpha's unprecedented connection with a human. "It's over," Dominic murmured against her hair. "She can rest now, and so can you." But Christina knew it wasn't truly over. Victor's coven might be scattered, but his words about war had carried conviction. And the mystery of Crescent Valley, why the energy field was expanding, why vampires had chosen this moment to break the treaty, remained unsolved. For now, though, she allowed herself this moment of grief and comfort in Dominic's arms, surrounded by a pack that had fought alongside her despite her human limitations. They had won this battle together. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way. As they prepared to leave the caverns, Christina cast one last look at the dust that had been Victor. "Goodbye, Melissa," she whispered. "I found the truth. I hope it's enough." Dominic's hand found hers, warm and solid in the cavern's chill. "Come," he said gently. "Let's go home." Home. The word carried new meaning now. Riverwood was no longer just the place where Melissa had disappeared. It had become something more. A place of truth, of connection, of unexpected allies who had become something like family. With Dominic beside her and the pack surrounding them protectively, Christina left the darkness of Crescent Valley behind, emerging into the moonlit forest where the first stars were beginning to appear in the night sky. Chapter 10. New Pack. Dawn broke over Riverwood, pale light filtering through the trees as Christina stood at the window of Dominic's cabin. The events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike in the gentle morning glow. The desperate battle in the caverns, Victor's death, the revelation of Melissa's fate. Yet the bruises on Christina's body and the hollow ache in her heart confirmed the reality of it all. The pack had retreated to Dominic's private cabin after leaving Crescent Valley, a secluded structure deeper in the woods than the main pack house. Here they had tended their wounds and begun the process of coming to terms with all that had happened. Emma was recovering under Mike's care, her shifter healing abilities slowly restoring her strength after the vampire's feeding. Sophia and the others had taken turns standing guard, though the immediate threat appeared to have passed with Victor's death. Christina heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Dominic approaching, 2 steaming mugs in his hands. He had fully returned to human form, though the battle had left its marks on him, a healing gash across his chest, bruises along his jaw, a weariness in his eyes that spoke of more than physical exhaustion. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the mugs. "You haven't slept." "Neither have you," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending a now familiar warmth through her that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. "Shifters need less rest than humans," Dominic said, though the shadows under his eyes belied his casual tone. "And I needed to make sure the pack was secure." They stood together at the window, watching the forest awaken. Birds began their morning songs, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. One of the pack members on patrol, Christina guessed. "What happens now?" she asked finally, the question encompassing far more than just the immediate future. Dominic took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "The treaty has been upheld, but at a cost. Victor's coven is scattered, not destroyed. Some will return to their traditional territories and respect the old boundaries. Others may seek revenge. And Crescent Valley, the energy field? Helen is researching that. The expansion isn't natural, something or someone has been tampering with the ley lines. We'll need to investigate further, but not today. He set his mug down on a nearby table. Today is for healing, for remembering those we lost. Christina nodded, thinking of Melissa. The confirmation of her death had been both devastating and, in a strange way, freeing. The uncertainty that had haunted her for a year had been replaced by grief, painful, but cleaner somehow. "I should write to our parents," she said quietly. "They deserve to know what happened to her, even if I can't tell them the whole truth." "What will you tell them?" Christina considered the question. "That Melissa was investigating disappearances in the area. That she was killed by the same people responsible for those disappearances, who have now been brought to justice. It's not the whole truth, but it's not a lie either." "And what about you?" Dominic asked, his voice softening. "What will you tell them about your plans?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Christina turned to face him fully, setting her own mug aside. "That depends," she said carefully, "on what those plans might be." Dominic held her gaze, the amber of his eyes warming in the morning light. "Last night, in the cavern, when I thought Victor might kill you." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've faced death many times as Alpha. I've seen pack members fall in battle, but the thought of losing you—" He shook his head, unable to complete the sentence. "I felt it too," Christina admitted. "When I saw you fighting him, when you were hurt, it was like something was being torn from inside me." "The bond," Dominic said simply. "What's growing between us? It's rare, Christina, especially between a shifter and a human." "You mentioned that before. What exactly does it mean?" Dominic moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Shifters form deep connections, to our pack, to our territory. But the strongest bond is between mates. It transcends ordinary relationships, linking two souls in ways humans rarely experience." "And you think that's what's happening between us?" Christina asked, her heart beating faster despite her attempt to remain calm. "I know it is." His certainty was absolute. "From the moment I found you in the library that night, something in me recognized something in you. The wolf knew before the man did." Christina thought back to their first encounters. The inexplicable tension, the way she'd been drawn to him despite his initial coldness, the sense of recognition that had defied logical explanation. "But I'm human," she said, voicing the obvious complication. "I can't shift. I don't have your strength or healing abilities. I'd be a liability to an Alpha." "You proved last night that being human doesn't make you a liability," Dominic countered. "You saved Emma. You helped defeat Victor. Your humanity didn't weaken us. It gave us strength we wouldn't have had otherwise." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "The question isn't whether I want a human as my mate. It's whether you want this life. A life with the pack, with the dangers and responsibilities that come with it. With me." Christina leaned into his touch, her decision already made, though she hadn't acknowledged it until this moment. "I came to Riverwood looking for Melissa. I thought once I found what happened to her I'd leave, go back to my old life." She shook her head slightly. "But that life feels distant now, like it belonged to someone else." "And this life?" Dominic asked, his hand cradling her cheek. "What does it feel like?" "Like coming home," Christina whispered. "Like finding something I didn't know I was looking for." The tension that had been building between them since their first meeting finally broke. Dominic leaned down as Christina rose to meet him, their lips coming together in a kiss that felt inevitable. His arms encircled her, strong and protective, while her hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. The kiss deepened, carrying all the emotion they'd held back during the danger and chaos of the past days. When they finally parted, Both slightly breathless, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "The pack will need time to adjust," he said quietly. "Some more than others." "Sophia," Christina guessed. Dominic nodded. "She's protective of the pack's traditions, of me. But she'll come around when she sees what I already know, that you belong with us." A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. They separated slightly as Dominic called for the visitor to enter. Sophia stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral as she took in their proximity. If she had opinions about finding them so close, she kept them to herself. "The pack is gathering," she announced. "They're asking for you, both of you," she added, with a slight nod to Christina that felt like a significant concession. "We'll be right there," Dominic replied. When Sophia had gone, Christina looked up at Dominic questioningly. "Why would they want to see me?" "Because they sense what's happening between us," he explained. "An alpha's mate affects the entire pack. They need to acknowledge you, to begin accepting you as part of their family." "And if they don't?" Christina couldn't help asking. "They will," Dominic said with quiet confidence. "Some may take longer than others, but they will. You've earned their respect, Christina. The rest will follow." They made their way to the main room of the cabin, where the pack had assembled. Christina recognized most of them now. Mike with his impressive beard, Emma looking pale but determined as she sat wrapped in a blanket, Marcus standing protectively near her, and several others whose names she was still learning. Helen was there too, though not technically a pack member, her knowledge of the supernatural making her a valued ally. Conversation ceased as they entered, all eyes turning to them. Christina felt a moment of uncertainty, acutely aware of her humanity among these powerful supernatural beings. But Dominic's hand found hers, his touch grounding her. Sophia stepped forward, her role as beta making her the pack's voice in formal matters. "Alpha," she acknowledged Dominic, then turned to Christina. "Christina Jones." The use of her full name carried weight in this context. Formal, respectful. Christina straightened her shoulders, meeting Sophia's gaze directly. "Last night you fought alongside the pack," Sophia continued, her voice carrying to all present. "You showed courage, resourcefulness, and loyalty that many born wolves would envy. You helped save one of our own at risk to yourself." She glanced at Emma, who nodded in confirmation. "And you helped bring justice for your sister and others who fell victim to the vampires." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered pack members. Even those who had been most skeptical of Christina's involvement seemed to be reassessing their opinions. "More than that," Sophia added, her eyes flicking briefly to where Dominic and Christina's hands remained joined. "You have formed a bond with our alpha that none can deny. The pack feels it. The territory acknowledges it." She took a deep breath, as if the next words didn't come easily to her. "On behalf of the Riverwood pack, I recognize Christina Jones as a friend of the pack, under our protection and entitled to our loyalty." She paused, then added with visible effort, "And as our alpha's chosen mate, should both parties confirm this bond." The formal declaration hung in the air. Christina felt Dominic's hand tighten around hers, offering support but leaving the response to her. This was her choice to make, publicly and irrevocably. "I came to Riverwood searching for my sister," Christina said, her voice clear and steady. "I found her fate, but I also found something I never expected. A place where I belong. People who fight for what matters, who protect their own." She looked up at Dominic, drawing strength from the warmth in his eyes. "And someone who makes me feel more at home than I've ever felt before." She turned back to the pack, meeting each gaze in turn. "I don't know all your ways yet. I can't shift or heal like you can. But I can promise my loyalty, my strength, and everything I am to this pack. To your alpha." Her voice softened. "To Dominic." A moment of silence followed her words. Then Mike stepped forward, his bearded face breaking into a broad smile. "Well said, lass." He looked around at the others. "I, for one, welcome Christina to the pack. She's more than earned her place among us." Emma, despite her weakened state, raised her voice next. I owe her my life. She belongs with us. One by one, the pack members voiced their acceptance, some enthusiastically, others with reserved nods, but none objected. Even Sophia, who had been the most resistant to Christina's involvement, gave a formal bow of acknowledgement. Then it is decided, Dominic said, his voice carrying the authority of the Alpha, but also a warmth that made Christina's heart swell. Christina Jones's pack. The simple declaration transformed something in the atmosphere. Christina felt it like a physical change, a sense of belonging, of connection to everyone in the room. Not the supernatural bond that Dominic had described between mates, but something human and no less powerful for it. Family. Home. Later, as the gathering dispersed and plans were made for rebuilding after the battle, Christina found herself on the cabin's porch with Dominic. The morning had advanced, sunlight dappling the forest floor through the canopy of trees. So I'm pack now, she said, still adjusting to the idea. What does that mean exactly? Dominic smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. It means you're one of us, protected, respected, part of our family. His arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. And as my mate, it means you stand beside me in all things. Even though I can't shift, can't run with the pack under the full moon. The wolf is only part of who we are, Christina. You've seen that. What matters is the heart, the spirit. He pressed a kiss to her temple. And yours is as fierce as any wolf's. Christina leaned into him, feeling the rightness of their connection. I still have so much to learn about your world. Our world, he corrected gently. And we have time. The threat isn't over. Victor's remaining followers, the mystery of Crescent Valley's energy field, but we'll face those challenges together. Together. The word held new meaning now. Christina thought of Melissa, of the truth she'd discovered about her sister's fate. The grief remained, would always remain in some form, but it no longer defined her. She had found justice for Melissa, and in doing so, had found her own path forward. What are you thinking? Dominic asked, sensing her introspection. That Melissa would approve, Christina replied honestly. She always told me I was too cautious, too unwilling to take risks that mattered. She smiled up at him. This is definitely a risk that matters. Dominic's laugh was low and warm. Indeed it is. His expression grew more serious. I can't promise it will always be easy. Being part of a shifter pack, being with an alpha, it comes with complications. I don't want easy, Christina said, rising on tiptoes to brush her lips against his. I want real. I want you. I want this life we're building. As Dominic's arms tightened around her, Christina felt the last pieces of her old life falling away. The journalist who had arrived in Riverwood seeking answers had found them, but had also found something far more precious. A new beginning, a new family, a new love that defied the boundaries between human and supernatural. In the distance, a wolf howled, a sound that once would have sent chills down her spine but now felt like a welcome. The pack was calling, acknowledging the dawn of a new day. And for the first time since arriving in Riverwood, Christina felt ready to answer that call, to step fully into this new world that had become her own. With Dominic beside her and the pack behind them, she faced the forest that had once held only mystery and loss. Now it held promise, protection, and a future she could never have imagined but couldn't imagine living without. Home, she whispered, the word both an acknowledgement and a commitment. Dominic's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. Home, he agreed, and together they stepped forward into their shared future, human and wolf, bound by something stronger than either had ever known before.